On behalf of Swansea University, welcome you all enormously to this conference. It's a real pleasure to have the British Society of Criminology working alongside with us for this conference today. I've had a real privilege over the last 5 years of being head of the law school in Swansea, and the law school included the Department of Criminology, and they are, as you will already know, and if you don't know fully yet, you will by the end of today, a fabulous team to be working with. And it's a really exciting time for us, and I suspect for the criminology crew, that we are transitioning from being part of the law school to a new faculty, where criminology will be part of a faculty of social sciences, not something that currently we have in Swansea. So it's an exciting time, and they will be building on enormous success and enormous interest, which intersects tremendously with the themes of today's conference. It's only a year ago that I think we were planning, hosting this conference, also planning things like with Debbie and with Tracy, we popped along to Swansea Prison to discuss a programme that we were going to be delivering in partnership with them, something that of course has now had to be parked up. And for me, one of the really profound worries of our current situation, and of course, you know, I'm not addressing here COVID and its impact specifically, but is how what criminology researches, deals with, addresses, explores, is something that is so hidden from public understanding and public knowledge. I was sitting as a Crown Court recorder a couple of weeks ago and was sentencing in 2 cases. One was a sex offender, and of course there was all of that discussion around what is the best option in sentencing in a sex offending case, and the other was a serious drugs case where of course the sentencing guidelines leave very little flexibility for looking at options. And all of this is so much relevant, so significant to society, and yet actually it's all largely tucked away unless something goes wrong. And then the discourse is all around how inadequate the criminal justice system and the understanding of criminological behaviours is. So anything, everything from every direction that you can do as a community that is researching, teaching in your range of disciplines, anything you can do to raise that public awareness and understanding of the importance of your disciplines is absolutely crucial to the proper running of our communities and our societies. It is so evident to us. And what is really challenging is making it important and understood by others. So over to you in your discussions today, in looking at the ways in which we can raise awareness, we can educate, and we can reach out with the fabulous research that you are all doing so that there is a greater awareness of its significance, its import, and how it can change lives and through lives society. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thank you, Eldon. Oh, wonderful to see you here, and thank you for giving your time to opening this event. Good morning, everybody. My name is Debbie Jones. I'm an Associate Professor of Criminology here at Swansea University. And I'd just like to extend a very warm welcome to the panel for giving their time today to come to talk about the public criminologies that we're all engaged in, and also to you as the audience. Thank you for coming from far and wide to take part in this event, and I hope you find it helpful. This event is co-hosted with the British Society of Criminology, and I'm delighted that the chair of the Learning and Teaching Network is here with us today. So I'm going to hand over to, Kate seems to, there's Kate. I'm going to hand over to Kate just to say a few words before we set up the format for the day. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, I'd just like to welcome everyone as chair of the Learning and Teaching Network to this symposium today. Again, I think it's great that we've managed to rearrange this since we had to postpone it pretty much to the day, which has already been noted. And it's really good. It's another example to see how we've managed to meet the many challenges that we've had to face during COVID with higher education. And to provide this half-day event, which I'm hoping everyone is going to enjoy the discussions and the conversations we have on public criminology. It seems really timely to have this event today when we've shown continuous illustrations of how in higher education we've had to adapt and be flexible to many of the problems that have arisen during COVID, and we've often gone above and beyond with regards to moves to blended learning, to carry on doing our research, to online learning, to digitally upskill, and also developing changes in assessment and curriculum design. So this event today is a brilliant opportunity for us to see, for me actually, and some of those that are attending as well, how the issues relating to public criminology have developed since my institution, the University of Lincoln, hosted the annual event in 2019, which was on public criminology. And so we had some really good conversations and debates in that conference. And it will be fascinating to see how we've all kind of developed those over the last couple of years. What I think this symposium today offers us, or it's, as I say, very timely, but it's an opportune moment to stop and think, to reflect, to evaluate upon what we've achieved in these very difficult times and what we can learn on to develop for the future. So I'm really excited that today's event is happening, and I'm looking forward to hearing all of the papers and getting involved in the discussions. So I will hand over to Anthony, who I think is chairing the first session. So yeah, thank you very much. Very, very excited to be here.
Can I just say before Anthony starts the session, just to sort of say the way the two sessions will run today, we'll have 3 papers in each session, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions of the panel at the end of the presentations. If you could put any questions you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and the chair of each session will pick those questions up. So yeah, over to Anthony.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everyone. Well, today we've got some really interesting papers coming up, and we're going to begin with Anna Grady, Paul Hamilton and Kirsty Teague. We're going to be talking about Learn Together, what role for partnerships and a dialogic pedagogy. So over to you guys.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I'm going to kick off this trio. It's really lovely to be part of this conference. I'm Dr. Anna Grady, and I work with my colleagues, Dr. Paul Hamilton and Kirsty Teague at Nottingham Trent University. And what's really nice for us is that we are an interdisciplinary team. So I always feel like the outsider in these sorts of discourses because I'm an educationalist, not a criminologist. So I think I bring something unique to the team, but that's something that we debate regularly and routinely. And we have different views about that. But we spend a lot of time talking about that, and I'm very conscious that we don't have a lot of time this morning. So I'm going to take you through a project that we've been working on for the last few years here in the East Midlands. It's a programme called Learning Together, and this is a programme which Kirsty will tell you about in much more detail as we go through the presentation. So we're going to share the presentation between the 3 of us. But as an overview, I want to just first set the scene in terms of the policy discourse that we work within here at in England. And then we're going to go through the programme, the practice, the pedagogy, how we've worked in partnership, which is the critical component, with our HMP partners. And what's been great, but often which is the thing that people are most interested in, what have been the challenges, what have been the problems. And the conclusions that we've drawn from that work and the next steps. And my fabulous colleague Kirsty is going to try and track our discussion and share the slides for us. So thank you, Kirsty. So I'm sure that many of you may be familiar with the landscape of educational policy in relation to prison education. But just as a summary, it is an ongoing conversation, but it had a renewed focus back in 2015-16, where Dame Sally Coates was charged with undertaking a really detailed critical review of education in prisons and its contribution to enabling prisoners to make different choices and to enable them to have a different set of circumstances once they'd relocated into mainstream society. She made 31 recommendations as part of her conclusions, which were all accepted by the government in 2018 in their response to her findings. And the education and employment strategy then became the framework through which education in prisons has been delivered. And those of you who are familiar with education in prisons will know that it's a universal failure. It's the branch of adult education in England, and it is systematically problematic. It's overlooked, its quality is poor, and there is a declining picture of quality. And there are multiple reasons for that, and many of them are not in any way to do with either the learners or the providers, but mostly to do with the system and the constraints within which it's trying to establish itself. And one of the challenges for education in the prison estate is enabling strong leadership to be able to drive the educational offer, which is compromised often by the priorities given by the day-to-day penal estate. But what is really, really helpful for us as educationalists who are really interested in supporting the educational offer in prison is a continued renewed effort by our government in England to look at what is the role of education given the climate that we're living in, and are prisoners being left behind in the educational offer, particularly as we've already heard this morning in the opening remarks, how adaptable and flexible we've had to be in all levels of education, but how uncompromisingly problematic that's been in the prison estate to the extent that actually education is currently stalled and is not happening largely at all. And in fact, we can see over the last number of years that prison education, the outcomes from those engaging in education in prison have been declining. And what's quite startling by this graph that you can see in front of you is not only that there's a steady decline, but there's a significantly decreasing offer of qualifications or opportunities to engage in education beyond level 2. So beyond the standard level 1 and level 2, and that it implies that there isn't the desire or the need for education beyond level 2. And whilst we all know that approximately 50 to 60% of the prison population have quite low levels of literacy and numeracy capability, what that also means on the flip side is that 40 to 50% don't. And therefore, there needs to be an offer for the full cohort. So that's just setting the landscape for you in terms of the policy framework in which we're working in England. It's largely about low-level education that is qualification-driven and about the ambition to get people in prison to a minimum basic standard of education so that they can, once they are released into the mainstream society, are more enabled to obtain employment, which is a very narrow, prescriptive, economic capital principle upon which education is offered. So I'm going to pass on to my colleague Kirsty now, who's going to take you through the Learning Together programme.
Bro, thank you, Anne. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Learning Together at Nottingham Trent University, and it's something that we've been doing for quite a few years now. You might have heard about it quite recently. And basically, in a nutshell, what Learning Together is an opportunity for students in prison to learn alongside higher education students in the same space. So it's an educational initiative that brings two cohorts, sometimes considered to be two very different cohorts together in the same space. And we often do this within a HMP partner, and we've got multiple, which my colleague Paul Hamilton is going to talk to you about shortly. And it's an opportunity for students to engage in something that is quite innovative and exchange knowledge relating to social sciences subject matter. So as Anne's already mentioned, she is an educationalist and Paul and I are criminologists, and we have a programme which cuts across both of those disciplines. So Learning Together essentially aims to engage in real talk, and that essentially means that we have some quite authentic conversations in a penal setting. Typically that's in kind of the visits hall, which is our liminal educational setting for Learning Together. And we engage in discussions around what is prison for, what is prison education, what is justice. We really engage in kind of we try and answer the big questions, as it were. And we come to all of this with the hope that we can kind of move past book learning and actually engage in conversations and learn about people's lived experiences. So we have this parity in the learning space whereby we encourage everyone to engage in whatever it is that we're talking about in that particular day. So that might be prison education, for example. And as I said, parity, this word parity, is something that's quite central to the way in which we go about learning together. And as I said, everyone has the same opportunities in the learning space to engage in whatever way they like and whatever way they can. But parity also comes down to things like language as well. So we don't kind of use stigmatizing language, or we refer to everyone as students or colleagues. And that's really important for encouraging engagement and making sure that everyone's treated as an equal as they are. And as I said before, the Learning Together programme at NTU cuts across education. So we have students, half of our higher education cohort is made up of BA education and joint honours education students, as well as half being BA Crim students. And with that, it's an opportunity for a sharing of interdisciplinary knowledge in that learning space. And one of the things that we really pride Learning Together on is it being an opportunity for students to actually engage in social justice and civic engagement. So we teach about these things, you know, in our courses, in our modules, but this is actually an opportunity to really embody those principles and actually do something that, you know, perhaps they wouldn't normally get the opportunity to do. So for us, typically Learning Together is an opportunity for students and staff to engage in really critical discussions. It's typically small group ones where students get the opportunity to build relationships with different kinds of students. So that might be the BA Criminology students building relationships with BA Education, as well as the HMP students. So one of the things that I'm sure my colleagues would agree on is that we've been privy to some, you know, really fascinating and critical conversations throughout the years. And that's something that we particularly love about the programme. So as I said, our programme cuts across education, criminology and prison sociology as well, actually. So we consider key education theory, which Anne's going to come on to shortly. But we also engage in some really important debates around what is prison and what is prison education. We talk about the philosophies of punishment, things like desistance theory, desistance principles, and it's really interesting to have those conversations, for example, about desistance with people that are coming from perhaps living on the other end of it and going through it, students that are studying it from an academic point of view and things like penology. So as I said, we have some really interesting conversations and critical conversations in that space. Each week, so typically over a 10-week period, the programme is actually built upon principles of flipped learning. So what will happen is the students are given the programme at the start, and we will provide them with some key readings that they need to do before coming to a particular session. So there's typically 2 for each week. And again, I come back to the notion of parity again. All readings are kind of paper-based to ensure that nobody is advantaged or disadvantaged by how we give material. And then what will happen is 1 week we will have a session led by a lecturer that's kind of introducing the topic and the kind of key questions around it. I will engage in some pertinent conversations, and that will be guided by some structured questions. And then the following week is very much seminar based. As our programme isn't credit bearing, it's not accredited, and that's really important for the engagement of learning together and who we kind of get to take the course. But what we work towards at the end is a celebration event, and at that celebration event, students will present a group project. It's typically academic poster of that kind of variety to an audience. And one of the things that all students are always really grateful of is that they come away from this with a certificate, and the certificates are exactly the same for the H&P and the NTU students, again to reinforce this parity that we have within the cohort. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Paul, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the partnerships that we have.
Thanks, Kirsty. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think, as Kirsty just said, what's nice about our Learning Together programs, it cuts across different disciplines. But what's also really nice is that it cuts across different institutions. So it's been really nice to operate these programs with different prison partners. And we've been doing it for 4 or 5 years now. We started at Loudoun Grange, which is a Cat B training prison, about 8 miles north of the city centre in Nottingham. It's also a privatised prison, so it's run by Serco. And we've run 3 programmes at Loudoun Grange. So that's one type of institution. But then we have a very different type of institution. We'll talk about this in a second, about the impact that the institution has on learning together. But we've also operated learning together at Watton Prison, which is a prison which is dedicated for those that have been convicted of a sexual offence. And again, we've been running that programme for a little while now. We've done 3 programmes there. Most recently, we've also delivered a Learning Together programme at Sudbury, which is a Cat D open prison. And what's been really nice about that is it's shaped the way that we've delivered learning together in a slightly different way. We're very lucky actually to be able to use Rodham release on temporary licence to share the learning across different campuses. So we've had it at an NTU itself, but also in the prison as well. And actually that is very much tied into the ethos of what Learning Together is about.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the practice, just with the caveat that our chair has just told us we've got 2 minutes and we're only just getting started really. But the basis of our Learn Together programme is based on the theoretical framework provided by Paulo Freire, which is about critical pedagogy. It's about the value of learning based on lived experiences, based on shared experiences, and based on discussion, and recognising that everybody in the space has the opportunity to co-construct new knowledge and new understanding, so that there isn't actually, or there is the capacity to challenge power, and that the aim is to flatten the power relationships within the learning space, so that the learning becomes an action rather than a recipient of knowledge, that people become enabled to have critical dialogue, to agitate for their own knowledge and understanding, and that it becomes completely participatory, that there isn't this assumption that there is knowledge to be gained and to be known and to be received, but more that knowledge is to be questioned and reviewed and analysed and renewed. We're just going to keep on talking until we're told not to, I think. But there is a paper based on this presentation that we can make available going forward. Okay, I'm going to pass on to you, Kirsty, really quickly.
Thanks, Anne. So I'll probably end on the positives, which isn't a bad place to end, really, is it? So we could have done a whole presentation just on the positives, but in terms of the student experience, and I mean that in the broadest sense, there's so many positives that come from participating in learning together. So we can kind of break that down into personal kind of value. So one of the things that the students often comment on is that it's increased their confidence, they've become more open-minded and non-judgmental as a result of participating in learning together. It also helps all students in terms of the academic sense. So I spoke a bit about the programme and the things that we discuss in the learning space. It broadens their understanding of things such as what prison is for, prison education, and lots of other things. But I think we tie these 2 bullet points together at the end. One of the things that's most interesting to us as kind of facilitators of learning together is learning together's ability to challenge and change people's perspectives and understandings on all of those things. And I think that's something that's really powerful in learning together, the ability for it to actually change. For example, from the NTU students' perspectives, they learn a lot about topics related to penology and criminology in modules, in textbooks, and them actually going into the space and talking with people who have lived experience of prison and prison education. That is something that's really powerful. So I'm gonna leave it there because I think I'm already over time. But thank you, and I'm sure we're all happy to kind of answer any questions on learning together.
Great, thank you all very much. A massive thank you to my colleagues from Nottingham Trent. I'm glad somebody mentioned Paulo Freire. I'm a massive fan. Pedagogy, excellent. So pleased to hear that. Thank you all very much. Can I just say to everybody listening as well, please, these are brilliant discussions and really interesting topics. If you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A. We've got time at the end, or we hope we'll have time at the end, to have a quick discussion, so please put some questions in. Next, we've got Joey Whitfield from Cardiff, who's going to be talking about his papers called Lessons from Prison Teaching for the University Classroom, Strategies and Risks. Over to you, Joey.
Thanks. Can I share my screen? Not that I...
Hi, Joe. Yes, sorry, go on, Anne.
Sorry, big green button at the bottom.
Oh, yeah, right, cool. Okay, there we go. Oh, I think people can see. Can you see my slides? Yeah. Oh, sorry, that's not the first one. Okay, so I'm talking actually about very similar topic. My name's Joey Whitfield, and I'm not actually a criminologist really at all. My background is in literary and cultural studies, and I actually lecture in the department, in the Spanish department at Cardiff University. So really I'm a Latin Americanist, but within that, my work is mostly about issues to do with sort of crime and punishment, although I approach them mostly through literature and film studies. So my PhD which in our book is called Prison Writing of Latin America. So it's sort of a study of Latin American prisons, but through kind of novels and texts that have been written by prisoners or people who were in prison. So that's, yeah, sort of my background, sort of a little bit different, which will become, I think, is relevant in this presentation. So I'm going to just going to talk about how I set up a prison university learning exchange, very, very similar to the one we were just hearing about, but in the tradition of inside out. And then I'm going to talk about what I kind of learned from that a little bit, how it turned out, and then some of the risks and mistakes I think that I made when then trying to deliver some similar teaching, but in the ordinary university classroom. So yeah, the Inside Out is just as with Learning Together. It's basically based on the exact same idea, although Inside Out predates Learning Together by about a decade and started in the United States. But yeah, the idea is exactly the same. You have a module or a course which is delivered in a prison to a class ideally composed of an equal number of inside and outside students, although in practice it can be hard to get the numbers exactly the same, but that kind of principle of parity is still there. So like I say, it was developed in 1997, the first one was delivered, I think, and there's now sort of a global network of people doing that, doing Inside Out teaching. As with Learning Together, also inspired by Gilberto Freire, although I guess in the States they also see their heritage as coming from the kind of civil rights movement and the Highlander school of Miles Horton. But yeah, it basically uses kind of transformative and experiential pedagogy, as we were sort of hearing about in the previous presentation. And you know what that actually means, very similarly, is that the classes are delivered in a sort of dialogical way, mostly through the use of a kind of facilitated discussion and guided group activities. And what I've done in Cardiff is I started it maybe in 2018. Unlike the previous group, I'm not unfortunately part of a team of people doing it together. It's just me so far, kind of pushing and leading the whole thing, and it's been a real sort of journey of discovery, especially because I've been trying to get it accredited. From the very start, I really want the inside students, the imprisoned learners, to get university credits for what they do, and that has now been agreed. So if I'm able to deliver one next year, if COVID allows, they will get sort of university credits that will be equivalent to doing a kind of part of like an access module, so that if they wanted to come and do degrees, they will be able to, or it will count towards that. So it's sort of the equivalent of the courses the university offers for people who, you know, don't have A levels but want to come and do degree courses. And yeah, and so what I've actually taught is a course that I've called Crime and Social Justice in Global Perspective, which is a deliberately extremely vague title, because I want it to sort of, you know, I don't want it to just be me teaching it. And I have, you know, been able to rope in lots of other people and to do different sessions on different topics. Had colleagues from social sciences, from law, from journalism and media studies. So it's been a sort of very interdisciplinary, with every person just sort of offering their own single kind of standalone topic, and whatever they've been interested in. And so it hasn't necessarily had a kind of particularly clear arc as a course, but I think that's compensated for by the fact that we've had so many, you know, it's allowed me to connect with lots of colleagues in other parts of the university, and it's great especially for the inside students, to have lots of different people, I think, coming in, and yeah, they sort of really appreciate it. And yeah, similarly to Learning Together, the results are, you know, extremely rewarding from a student perspective. So some of the kind of feedback and comments that you have at the end. So from an outside student, for me, the gender class she's talking about was the class that most challenged my beliefs and preconceptions about the topic in question. So I delivered this one, actually. It was about sort of gender and criminology, as far as I could know about it. So she said, I felt quite tired after the class. It was really frustrating to talk so in depth about a topic and still come out with more questions than answers. Another student whose parents actually were both police officers, and a fact that she didn't reveal in the class, but yeah, but certainly kind of affected her attitudes going in at the beginning. She said, in my mind, crime and punishment are indisputably linked, but why? I'd spent my 22 years never questioning this. Why did I believe crime meant punishment? Why not resolution, justice, or restoration in certain instances? Some of the inside students. The way the crime and social justice course unfolds allows the inside students particularly to reflect on issues of crime and justice which may have personally affected on them and their loved ones. Means it could even form part of the rehabilitative process. And the whole experience has been hugely thought-provoking and thoroughly engaging, often giving me sleepless nights thinking about the day's meetings and topics discussed. I think we've gone through the full range of emotion at some of the facts we found out. So yeah, I think what you kind of get from those quotations is that this is, you know, very different to an ordinary university module, and that it is much more, it has the potential to be very powerful and very, you know, deeply affecting for both groups of learners. And, you know, in order to achieve that, it's necessary to have quite a kind of a different approach to learning, which we've heard about already. But I think, you know, what, you know, it does require you to approach the classroom very differently as a kind of, and to have this very different attitude as a facilitator of learning, and really to spend time kind of building and creating a real learning community, which is a sort of educational sort of kind of jargon, I suppose, that you sometimes hear when you're doing your sort of your little, you know, courses to get the HEA certificate and so on. But you really do have to spend time doing that, and there are quite sort of, and you know, because with the inside out sort of learning together classroom, you have these two groups of learners from very, very different backgrounds and very, very different perspectives, who are extremely nervous. Like both groups at the beginning of the course are really frightened on the first day, because of course the inside students have often had really poor experiences with education and associate the classroom with, you know, quite horrible things and feeling kind of bad and failing really. And they are, you know, meeting with university students who they perceive to be, you know, extremely erudite and well educated. And then the university students, by contrast, are very nervous because they're going to prison. You know, we in H&P Cardiff, we don't meet in the visitor centre. We have to go, we go into the education centre, which is quite, you know, you have to go right round the prison. You get kind of lots of shouting from the windows, and you know, it's quite intimidating. And so you really have to spend a lot of time kind of building that community, you know. And so the sort of practical way in which we do that is to, at the beginning of the first course, is to sort of create a kind of manifesto for the classroom, where you ask the students to come up with the content for and like a sort of bullet point list of behaviors and ways in which they would like other students to behave or not behave, and ways in which that you want the facilitator to behave and not behave, and so you and we kind of formalize that into quite a like a proper list, and remind the group of it at the beginning of each of the future lessons. And, you know, invariably they come up with the same kinds of things, like, you know, everybody should be respected, everybody should be listened to, no interrupting, no talking over the top of each other, everybody should be heard. But, you know, and you can, and if they miss out things that I think are important, then I will sort of add them in. But the point is, everybody feels like they've had a sort of buy-in, and it kind of creates this sense of safety and a kind of sense of trust within the room. You also set up the classroom a bit like a sort of AA meeting, with that everybody sat in a big circle and the different learners sort of alternating. You kind of use a talking piece to go round, so only the person holding the piece can talk. And also I always start every lesson with a kind of subtle icebreaker, which you don't say here is the icebreaker, because that really makes people groan, but you know, you sort of begin by some activity that makes everybody speak within the first few minutes, and that way you just naturally have a much better kind of atmosphere and much better participation in the rest of the class. And usually, you know, I don't have to enforce the rules of the manifesto for very long. People are very respectful and sort of take them on board. And then the other thing is that, of course, because of that educational, the different levels of formal education, you can't, you know, that most of the learning is, you can't just sort of deliver a lecture and you can't teach in the normal way that you would at universities, which is great, really. So yeah, you facilitate kind of active learning through the use of discussion, but also through kind of discussions and experiential learning tasks, which really encourage people to draw on their own personal experience and to bring that into the classroom to a certain extent. Although one of the rules of at least Inside Out, I'm not sure about Learning Together, is that the inside students are not to talk about the reasons why they're in prison, and the outside students aren't to ask them. Occasionally it does come up and it's not a huge deal, but that is sort of the one thing that's kind of off limits, really. Well, and that, and you know, addresses and everything like that. But yeah, and so, but what I started doing in Cardiff, well, since I did the Inside Out training, it was 2 years before I managed to set up the first course in Cardiff. But I started using a lot of those techniques just in my ordinary teaching, and trying to create the kind of learning community that that I saw that I, you know, knew I would be able to create in the prison, but also once I'd started doing that I saw. And so, you know, I did it principally in my own research-led module in the university, which is called Crime and Punishment in Contemporary Latin American Culture, which is very much a kind of a literature and film module. So about, you know, about Latin America. And yeah, so I did exactly the same things, the kind of classroom manifesto, the attention to the layout, the use of kind of icebreakers, and you know, and my concern with that module was especially that it can be a little bit kind of orientalizing, I think, to study kind of crime and the war on drugs in Latin American film. You know, you risk reinforcing a lot of stereotypes about kind of violent Latino culture. So I was always very concerned that the students would relate the content of that course to British reality and not see what was going on in Latin America as like a completely different. And so, you know, one exercise, just to give you an example, was that I sort of, in the first seminar discussion, I would get them all to anonymously write on a piece of paper in capital letters whether they, well, initially I'd ask them whether anyone in the room considered themselves to be a criminal, and of course no one does, and then I would ask them to anonymously write about whether or not they'd ever actually committed a crime, and of course usually, you know, 95% of them have done. And you know, and I will write down you know, my kind of anonymous confession as well. We collect them all up and then scramble them around and then sort of read them out. And of course it turns out that, you know, everybody has in fact broken the law at some point or other, but nobody considers themselves a criminal, and that kind of leads on to a sort of discussion about who gets criminalized and why and in what situations and so on and so forth. So kind of, you know, that's a kind of example of using people's own life histories, but and their own sort of experience in the ordinary university classroom. But there are also kind of risks. So I've, you know, sort of got very into designing very imaginative sort of experiential scenarios inspired by what I was doing in HMP Cardiff. But kind of hitting the unprepared undergraduate student with the experiential learning can actually be quite challenging. And I found that unless you do the work of kind of building trust and sort of creating that learning community in the classroom, they often really don't like it. And it also, by sort of turning yourself more into a facilitator rather than sort of just delivering all of the content and sort of doing exercises where the students provide the content, you're sort of running a bit of a risk that, you know, they will come out with sort of random or immature things. So I was teaching a course on the Cuban Revolution, again, just in the ordinary well, a class actually on the Cuban Revolution in an undergrad module. But this was for a big survey course where I was only teaching these 2 weeks on Cuba, and the students didn't know about the whole, you know, I didn't know the students well. I hadn't built that community, and so I did this exercise, which was sort of about the armed struggle debate that people had in Latin America in the 60s, which was all about whether or not they could, you know, whether it was ever justified to use violence, basically, for political ends in situations of real kind of repression. And so I got the students to give examples of sort of oppressive situations that they thought might justify this. In retrospect, Prevent probably should have been told about this class, but yeah, we had basically some students came out with some very kind of upsetting sort of content and situations to do with like abortion rights. And then we also had one student who talked about sort of Welsh independence movement and said that he wanted to kill all of the English, which I just sort of laughed at and didn't take very seriously. But the whole class, well, one student, an English woman student, was very upset by the whole class, and I ended up getting, well, she made a formal complaint, so I got investigated. And you know, I think, you know, from that, you know, I think you basically have to be kind of careful when you sort of with kind of opening up the classroom in that way. I mean, maybe I was naive, but about the content of that particular class. But another example is that I was doing a sort of taster session actually in the last strike in the teach out, where I was talking about inside out teaching. And I did a sort of an example of an inside out style class. And I did an icebreaker. And again, so I was talking sort of in a meta level about using kind of personal experience and emotion in the classroom. But I did this icebreaker, which I thought was, you know, which is a sort of one from Inside Out, where you just get students to finish the sentence. And they're in pairs and you sort of say a sentence. And they have to finish it off, and it's sort of a way for them to kind of get to know each other and sort of early in their course. And so one of the sentences that I read out was, you know, as a child I was known as, and you know, the idea being that somebody would just sort of talk a little bit about their childhood and the nickname that they were maybe called. And a participant, another academic, came up to me afterwards, and she was very upset and said, you know, you can't just spring that on people, like you know, that was very upsetting for me, because I remembered, you know, being called names as a child, and you know, it had never occurred to me that could be upsetting. But again, I think that what it had in common with the other class that went wrong was that I was sort of using emotion and getting people to sort of draw on their own lives sort of a bit unprepared without having done that work of building the learning community. So, you know, one conclusion could be, I think, maybe that because I've never had that kind of reaction or that kind of response or feedback from inside out classes, where people seem to really appreciate the learning is much more kind of personal. But yeah, so the conclusion basically is that you kind of, maybe it's that learners in prisons are kind of more resilient, or maybe it's that, you know, that was in a situation where I had sort of built that trust and spent the time kind of doing the work. So that's my presentation. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Joey. Absolutely fascinating stuff. There's always the danger of these sessions. We could always talk for far longer about the sort of intricacies of what's going on, but thank you so much. Our third set of talkers or speakers this morning in this session will be our very own Debbie Jones and Mark Jones, and their paper is Starting the Conversation, Higher Education and Desistance. So over to you, Debbie and Mark.
Thank you, Ant. I'm just waiting for Joey to stop sharing his screen, and then we'll share out.
Sorry.
Thank you, Joey. No worries. Let me find it. There we go. And we'll try and make up a little bit of time if we can as well. So over to you, Mark.
Brilliant, thank you. We're not married, by the way, just before we start off, Debbie and I. We've just got the same surname. Yeah, welcome to our presentation called Conversations, Community Higher Education and Desistance. Our research is with a community organisation called Include Hub, based in Swansea, and its members. And it started following a successful bid with the Society of Research of Higher Education, I think in 2009, where we got some research monies to explore the motivations, aspirations and barriers to HE from people that have experiences of the criminal justice system. So at that time, I was head of adult learning at Swansea, and Debbie was still in her current role now within criminology. And we thought it would be an ideal partnership, really, to explore the motivations and barriers. And so this is our research. Just got a real quick bit of setting the scene. Obviously, this could take a really long time, but we know that powerful forces for desistance include things like marriage, relationships, having a consistent and positive family dynamics. Also, employment is really important, and a key motivation and aspiration for those that are looking to desist, and having appropriate health and health support. But also, what's been found within the literature is education is a real hook for change, a real powerful opportunity for transformation from what you could describe as a criminal identity and offender identity, and providing you with opportunities to create different and positive social networks and shift the identity, a replacement identity, and a non-offending identity. The desistance journey, as has been captured in the literature, can be quite painful, and Nugent and Schnickel write about the pains of desistance. But what we found in the literature is there's not a lot of literature about the power of higher education. Although where there has been literature, it does suggest, due to the criticality, due to the analysis and the deeper learning that may take place within higher education, it could be and can be a very, very powerful force for change. At the kind of opposite end of that, we're also in a kind of situation, I think, within the UK, in terms of widening access, where widening access has grown in the last 5 years, but perhaps the widening access that has grown has focused on younger demographics of students in the 18 to sort of 24 age range, just because of also the growth of, if you like, of the neoliberalist university, where it is more of a kind of a profit-making industry now. There's been changes to the funding, and therefore that's forced universities to take that path. So you've kind of got a little bit of a contradiction in some respects when you look at adult learning. Adult learning actually in Wales and the UK has greatly declined in the last 10 years, although the OU has obviously grown considerably. And so we were really interested in what people with offending identities and experiences of the criminal justice system might think of accessing or taking on a kind of HE experience. And so we wanted to explore that, and so that's what we look to do with the funding from the Society of Research for Higher Education. So our kind of main area was to explore whether higher education could be viewed as a hook for change for adults outside of the prison environment. And I think that's what's quite unique about the research. We believe it's first of its kind in Wales, actually worked with those that have had experiences of the criminal justice system, but within a community setting. So although there were very strong flavours of the literature of prison education and higher education within prisons, it was kind of unique in that way. And we also wanted to see whether the idea of higher education might raise the aspirations of that community, those members within Include Hub, and whether they might be inspired to and want to engage with higher education. So we had 4 kind of key questions, and you can see those there. You know, what are the aspirations to study within HE? What barriers and problems and challenges might this group envisage? And within that, that might be also pulling on previous educational experiences, which was touched on by the previous presenter, Joey, as well. And what support might this group need to engage with HE? Again, looking at it from Swansea University perspective at the time, and still with Debbie now, how might Swansea University be able to support such adult learners? And therefore, how might HE support desistance from offending? So that was kind of the overall scope of the project.
Okay, so how did we go about designing the project? Well, we've heard about in the last two presentations about, innovative pedagogies that kind of look at how we deliver learning outside of traditional classroom settings. And I would say in this presentation and in the one with Tracy in the second session, what you'll see is that the approach that we take is something very similar to that research should be this empowering process. It isn't about researching on people, it's very much researching with people. So like Mark says, for this project, we incorporated a number of key stakeholders that would help us deliver what was required by the Society of Research into Higher Education. So I put a link there to Include's website, and I would encourage you all to go and have a look at that. And that's an organisation that Tracy and I have worked with for a long time, and we felt that they would be very appropriate to help us facilitate this project, because the ethos of Include is that everybody has parity, and we've heard that word used a lot already this morning, that their members are what would traditionally be called service users are actually members. They have a big say in how that project is run. We also work with the Prison Education Trust on this piece of research and took some advice on them about where we could see these findings perhaps fitting and informing policy and practice. We were really pleased that prison staff and the educational staff within the prisons were really keen to get involved. So that was really welcoming as well. And we also worked at the initial stages with the local further education college, who were looking to provide some of the skills-based education within the prison setting. But what was important to us was, as Mark said, that this was something that focused on education to a marginalised community, marginalised group of people within a community setting as opposed to the prison setting. So one of the ways that we carried out our research, and again I'm going to talk more about this in the second presentation, is to adopt a pictorial narrative mapping analysis. So on the initial slide you would have seen the little blue Beyonce Smurf, who became quite significant in this research. But this new idea, this emerging idea of this pictorial narrative mapping analysis, you can ask many questions about that if you'd like to in the chat afterwards. We haven't got room to really expand on that. But the images that you'll see came from that process. And that in itself was incredibly empowering for the people that took part in the project. So the way that there were several phases to this project. So we started off with a focus group, and I'll talk about the demographics of that group in a moment. But the focus group were members of the Include Hub, so what we traditionally call service users of the Include Hub. We then tried to conduct a short survey with those people, but that was really unsuccessful on any level. And perhaps, again, we can talk more about that in the Q&A if people would like to know why we think that was unsuccessful. And then we also worked with a focus group of stakeholders. So this was prison staff, staff from Swansea University, people from the Include Hub, so people who had a wider stakehold in this type of project that we were thinking about developing in the future. But today we're going to focus just on the first focus group and some of the findings from that. Just a breakdown here of some of the demographics of the people that took part in that first focus group. And we held this within the Include Hub, and we were really keen to ensure that this felt like an empowering event. In the past, Tracy and I have referred to these as engagement events. So we had a very informal day. We took sandwiches, we arranged a patron to come in. We paid the participants for their time to take part in this small study. And you can see that overall we had 16 participants. Now, those of you that are well embedded within research methods would be thinking, wow, that's a lot for a focus group. And I have to say it was. But not all 16 people were there at the same time. They came, they went, and when we toyed with this, and we've recently published an article on the findings from the project, and we talked about this a little bit in that article, that actually, if we hadn't done it this way, it would have become quite an exclusionary project rather than an inclusionary one. So people would come and go as they felt comfortable, they went around their business in the hub, and then they would come back to the discussions. But as you can see there, the profile was what we'd probably expect from somebody with an offending past. Everybody that took part in the focus group had a criminal conviction. And of course, as Joy's pointed out, that doesn't mean that, everybody else in the room hadn't committed some type of crime either. But, it is important to see there that the range of people that we had within that focus group and their experiences within the criminal justice system and their own personal experiences was quite wide. just going to talk a little bit about their aspirations and then hand back to Mark. Now, we went in there, you can see one of the research questions was, you know, what are their aspirations about perhaps undertaking a higher education degree in some fashion or a module? And really, I suppose I'm a mature learner, I'm late to education myself, and having been through that really positive experience, I thought, why wouldn't everybody want to go to university if they were given that opportunity? But actually, when we started to talk about aspiration, it became apparent really quickly that we would have to roll back our thinking on this a little bit. So the illustrations there, you can see one of the people in the group had been a nurse. And because of a drink driving conviction, he was unable to continue his nursing profession. So he wanted to get back to nursing. So we're talking about what are your goals, starting from that point of view. Lots of people, it was apparent during that initial discussion, had some serious mental health issues that they wanted to find some stability in their life. And that went wider than just their own personal mental health and well-being. It was very much about they wanted to have a home. A lot of the things that many of us are privileged to have in our lives were the very basic aspirations for this group of people. They wanted to have stable friends and family, people to support them, career, employment. And like I say, most importantly, the health and well-being was kind of their primary focus. And you can see there the McDonald's. Now, I've got to explain the McDonald's. When we actually asked that first question, you know, what are your aspirations? One of the members of the focus group said, well, my aspiration is to eat McDonald's out of every football stadium in the whole of England and Wales. And we were like, wow, okay, we're going to have to kind of rethink this a little bit about where we go with this level of aspiration. There's us having, you know, foreseeing them all coming out with degrees, and some people are just, as the quote saying there, I just want to survive. So I guess the point of this slide is to say that whenever we're thinking about working with people that come from marginalised communities, we have to think really about what are their basic fundamental needs to survive, rather than thinking about large-term aspirations. Well, Mark.
Absolutely. And when we sort of, again, the conversation did ebb and flow from different theme to different theme. But some of the barriers that this community cited and discussed was that to really achieve their aims, that there are always things like money to worry about and being able to earn money or gain money somehow. So that was a real problem. I think some of the biggest challenges that people really felt stigma and really felt that their crime identity was the only thing that people saw. And that was, you know, that was characterized by battling the system, and they don't want people on courses with problems. And as I think, as Debbie said earlier, there was also quite significant mental health issues. It's not surprising to know that educational experiences were really negative, and many just felt that during their educational experiences, it wasn't the right time for them. And really interestingly, and again, not surprisingly, it's captured in the literature, prison education really was the starting point for many. But it was definitely interesting to know that you kind of have to get over that bump, if you like, about reintroducing people to education. And education isn't a judgment, it isn't isolation, and it isn't bullying. It can be an empowering experience. And many people had never really experienced that unless they've done prison education. People were very, very suspicious of the university, this sort of big monolithic building campus. And they felt that they were looked at differently there, that there was stigma, there was definitely suspicion and mistrust. In fact, 3 of the members had been to university, and that had almost embedded further their mistrust of universities, because they felt they weren't advised appropriately and the course wasn't right for them, and they weren't delivered on what was promised. So you had a lot of this system intimidation, and they also kind of align universities of not getting them a job, and that universities are only out for the money. But then, really interestingly, it was like, but we'd all have to go. And we even had quotes like one of the members there would walk across campus because it would make him feel good. So when I walk across campus, I hold my head up high, and it feels a good place. So that was really interesting as well. It was almost, there was a contradiction in that dialogue. So when we started kind of challenging a little bit that universities don't get you a job, what could HE do for you? Most people admitted that it does open doors for the future, that it can prepare you for work, that it definitely gives you more skills and knowledge, and therefore gives you more confidence. And in that way, can reach those other aspirations about employment and money security. And what was also really interesting is the kind of the perceived social and health elements where, you know, they'd be less lonely, and there was definitely talks around helping their mental health and and helping their feelings of isolation. But they definitely wanted something to be able to achieve that, and that was better access, better support, and funding so that it wasn't costly, and small group face-to-face, largely interactions as well was a very dominant thing. So again, we really rushed through it today just for the time. We could have spoke for a lot longer, and we kind of got to the position where we feel that this research illustrates for us and where the university is perhaps. It's about starting the conversation, and how do you do that honestly and openly? And one of the first things that's very, very apparent is that universities need to develop more holistic support for complex needs. So the support's there, but you kind of need that wraparound. Youth work might call it a one-stop shop type approach, so that nobody engaging from a background where they've had experience of the criminal justice system feels that they're opening up multiple doors, because that's further stigma, further worries and further barriers. So that was definitely one of the recommendations from the research that we did, and that we included in our journal article.
Yeah, so I think the other points that we wanted to make here, and I'm just kind of thinking when we wrote this presentation, obviously we didn't know what the other speakers were going to talk about as well. But I think, you know, we've heard of two excellent models of university and prison partnerships and the widening access agenda and how we do that. But what was coming out of our research, and actually what's sticking in my mind from the first two presentations, is this idea that universities really need to knock down some of these barriers to, for example, getting modules accredited. You know, why are we still waiting? Why is Joy still trying to get through that bureaucratic process to get these modules accredited by the university? You know, if they are committed to widening access in that true sense of the word, I suppose. Mark, do you want to do the next one?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just to say that one of the things that definitely come through, and I think this was adult learning in Wales and England, maybe 10, 15 years ago. There was mass introductory courses and free taster sessions just for adult learning per se. But those have been eradicated and kind of definitely reduced in Wales. And so the university's kind of civic mission and attracting different groups, not just different groups of younger potential students, but much more marginalized communities. So introductory and free taster sessions were really important, embedded within the community. And what that does for us anyway, we feel, is it kind of suggests very strongly that universities need to work in partnership with prisons, but also with community organizations that support those from offending backgrounds or have experience with the criminal justice system, so that you have that specific knowledge and support within the community, and you can start to build trust, confidence, and that new student identity. And then you can probably bring people onto campus then in that more kind of traditional kind of delivery of university degrees, etc. So.
Yeah, and I think as well, you know, we've only focused on the findings from the first focus group. In the second focus group, there was a lot of discussion around training that staff may need within the university to broaden their understanding of the particular needs of this potential group of learners. So I think that was very important as well. And one thing that came out of the research that we haven't touched on here either, and I think this is something that we could go back to most definitely, is that the participants who had studied education in prison. So in our second focus group, there were two members of that focus group. One was doing a PhD and one was doing a master's degree from within prison. And they felt these multiple layers of stigma. They neither fit into the student identity. Universities didn't see them as that student. But equally, within the prison setting, they found that they experienced high levels of stigma from prison staff as well, who thought they were better than the prison staff. So I think, you know, we've put the specific educational training for HE staff, but I think if we do want to develop, you know, a very inclusive approach to encouraging education, whether it's in prison or within the community, then I think we do need to go back and look at some training perhaps for prison warders, you know, not prison officers, not necessarily the educational staff, but those wider people that students in prison are exposed to break down some of that stigma that they do really experience. And I guess ultimately what we'd be calling for is kind of a cultural change within that higher education environment. And I know certainly Elwyn mentioned this at the beginning, that we, you know, in Swansea we have tried to get this inside learning together type module off the ground Swansea Prison, but COVID has put paid to that for this year. But we are looking to develop that module further by taking it out into the community from almost the same group of learners, those that have a criminal conviction, but within a different structural setting as well. So I think the cultural change is coming within higher education, but I think it is slow to respond, and it can have some help. So that's it from me. Mark, have you got anything else to add?
Not at all. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and it'd be nice to answer some questions if there's any.
Great, thank you both very much. Some cracking talks there from all three papers and those who presented. We have actually got some questions. I'm mindful of the time, so how about if we work to around 10 to, so at least we can squish something in. If Tracy's not going to talk for half an hour at the end, we've got a little bit of time to catch up on chat then. So, and Tracy, I'm doing my best to get you out of this story. Okay, how about we deal with a more general question, first of all, which is from Joe James. And what he has asked is, were there any institutional barriers to your public education work, and were agencies welcoming of this approach? So whoever wants to answer, really.
Shall I start with that?
Please, Anne.
I think we had some real institutional challenges, surprisingly, from our own institution rather than from our HMP partners. Paul, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, or I can.
Yeah, I mean, I think the role of the institution, whether that be HE or the prison partner, shouldn't actually be overstated. You know, for me, it was whether they bought into the principles of learning together, or whether they're just sort of ticking that box to say, oh yes, we've got a learning together program. You know, it became quite fashionable for a while, and actually that isn't what this is about. You know, there's an underpinning principles that characterize a learning together program. And I think what our experience of doing learning together was that I guess it emphasized the sort of routinized nature of prison life. And actually it also reinforced a sense of power that's sort of embedded into every facet of prison life. Or when I say power, actually powerlessness. So there's sort of various examples of that played out throughout our learning together programs. I don't think any of our learning together programs started on time. They were all impacted on problems with movement, but within that, just a lack of communication and what was going on. So it just sort of reinforced some of those senses of how these things sort of around power and that sort of routinized nature just filtered down into everything. So I think we did experience some of that, and those institutional impacts were important. But as Anne just said, from our own institution, how much can I say of this? We had a situation that arose in one of our learning together partnerships, which challenged us from a security perspective. And the way that our prison partner responded was excellent. We couldn't have wished for anything more. It was an attitude of, these things happen, we'll deal with them. Whereas our own institution got very twitchy about what was going on, and we're actually quite potentially going to review how we delivered this. So I think it raised some very important questions for us about that whole nature of institutions and how those cultures play into delivery of this. No matter what you as a team are sort of striving towards, without the institutional buy-in, it sort of impacts on what happens.
Thank you. What other panelists, would you like to contribute to that question, or should we try another? What would you like?
I could just say, yeah, I think for me, it really, making it happen has depended on finding individuals in high places and sort of selling it to them. And when I was trying to work from the bottom up, certainly in the university, it was just computer says no for over and over and over. It was only when I did a sort of TED style talk to like one of the deans that it sort of all started to happen. I think a big institutional challenge, though, that between certainly working category B prisons versus universities is that they're on, it's like time is completely different in the two institutions. Like Cat B prisons work on a sort of month by month, you know, most of their education courses are sort of 3 weeks long in Cardiff. And obviously universities is 3 years. So it's almost like kind of going in and out of Narnia or something. And that mismatch is very challenging. I think it might be different working in a category A prison, I don't know, but but that's sort of something. It's just,
Can I just say something to sort of support what Joy's there? Joy was very graciously asked me to go along to the celebration event, and it was truly inspiring. I was delighted to be there, and that's what really pushed me on. Mark and I had been thinking about how we would develop this work when Mark was still with the university, but having been to Joy's event, it just made me see that this was something that had to happen. And I'm not just saying it because Elwyn is here, but having a head like Elwyn who takes a real interest in these type of projects was fundamental into getting us going so quickly with this body of work. And like say Tracy, Elwyn and I and the Director of Learning and Teaching go off to prison for the afternoon, and really talk through some of those challenges that might exist within the prison estate and within the institution. So I hear what all the speakers are saying today, and actually it's only COVID that stopped us, but we've got some ideas of how we can take that forward. I know Joy's been working with the head of learning and teaching for the whole of the prison estate across Wales, and we've got some ideas about how we can perhaps get some online information into those prisons, some online teaching into the prison estate as well. But again, we're having to go through the bureaucracy of the university to allow that to happen as well. So it's slow, I suppose. Slow.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. What we'll do is we'll take one more question. There's a couple more on there, but I think they're very specifically focused. So what we'll do is to Julia, for example. Julia Winston's asked a really good question. Julia, I'll take your details and pass it to Mark and Debbie so they can follow up with you. I wouldn't mind knowing more about the pictorial narrative mapping as well, so we might come back to that. However, there's a really good question from Jordan Dawson. And this is I think more aimed towards initially Debbie and Mark, but I think it's actually a wider question for others as well. I mean, how are individuals able to manage stigma and their own identities, initially within the focus group setting for Mark and Debbie, but also I think more broadly within the research process, how are people able to manage their identities in the different learning environments?
Mark, do you want to take that one?
And could you be more specific, as in what are identities, or could you rephrase the question? Sorry,
I was trying to generalise it there, but what Jordan was asking about is actually your own identities within that learning setting.
Okay. The first focus group was Debbie and I were in awe of it, because it was like Debbie said, it wasn't the 8 to 10 as is guided. We knew it would be informal. But we also knew, due to the provision, that people have got a lot of barriers and a lot of challenges and a lot of support needs. So for me, and maybe Debbie will chip in afterwards, the initial 5 to 10 minutes was very chaotic. And my background is youth and community work, so I work on this basis of kind of like reflecting in practice, and I call it detached attachment. So, but the university identity is kind of as an academic, and is slightly different as well. So initially, I'll be really honest, the first 5 to 10 minutes, I kind of had the academic identity, and it was quite shocked, and I had to have that attached attachment kind of reflect quite quickly, and I approached it much more from a youth and community work perspective then, and there was a much more go with the flow. It's not to say my academic identity is inflexible, but definitely I needed to engage with more sort of youth work and community work principles, and allow the chaos and pull out all the gold dust, which you can see from the pictures, from the narrative. There was so much power and deep meaning in there as well. So initially it was quite difficult. I mean, we didn't show any of that, but then it just became actually just really interesting, really fulfilling, and really fun, and a lot of admiration and feeling inspired by some of the challenges and stories that those members honestly and openly expressed was really moving and really inspirational. So that's kind of an overview, really, I guess, of how my identity interacted with that process.
Thank you. Sorry, go on, Debbie. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, I'd echo what Mark says there about thinking about your own identity in any of these situations where you are working with people who are perhaps not traditionally what we expect to be students, or what we expect to be traditionally research participants, if you like. And we've already heard from Anne, Kirsty and Paul about how you have to and Joy, about how you have to adapt those learning environments. And I think the research process was exactly the same as that. It was kind of flying by the seat of your pants a little bit, in all honesty, and seeing what happens, and then, you know, learning to manage those situations. But of course, you know, how do you manage those identities, where my previous occupation was as a police officer? So, you know, where do I make that disclosure in this group to say, well, actually, you know, I could have been one of those people that was responsible for you being in prison or getting that criminal conviction. But, you know, I think you have to judge the room, you have to judge that atmosphere and decide if you do declare some of those things. 99% of the time, I do declare it at the right time. But it's an interesting question, Jordan. Does anybody else have a view on that?
Well, I mean, sorry, did you want to go, Paul?
And you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
In all spaces, we have multiple identities, don't we? And you know, for me, it's about enabling those identities to be shared and embraced. And actually, we worked with our Learn Together partners and participants over the course of a few years, to such an extent that those identities really traversed where some of our Learning Together participants who were in Cat D prisons became our co-deliverers in the lecture space. So Paul, you'll be able to talk about how you've created those panels and those lecture spaces.
Yeah, just one thing I did want to say is I think that the nature of delivery helps with some of that identity. I think the fact that it's about dialogue gives it an authenticity, actually, and I think that helps. I think, you know, certainly the first couple of weeks you're finding your feet and it's difficult, but when you go through that process of dialogue, and it's not that sort of thing that Freire, you know, criticises, that banking model of education, you know, it's very, very different to that. I think that helps to manage that whole identity, you know. And when we were speaking with both sets of learners, actually, it's that sort of freedom and distance from the institutions that's important. You know, that's what Learning Together gave them. It was a sort of almost like suspending the realities of life on the wings for a moment. It just gave that intellectual space to do that. So I think that ability just to reconstruct a sort of, I guess, a sort of less judgmental, more equal narrative, which they didn't really, certainly the sort of inside students didn't really have the space to do that. And I think that dialogue and the model was helpful in doing that, to be honest.
Great, thank you. I think, sorry, because we are running slightly, I'm going to try my best here as chair to rein us back a little bit. What I would suggest is, I'll make a note to save the other questions we've got, and we will follow those up. So to all participants, we will follow that. I'm aware we're due to start again at 11. May I suggest, because it's now 5 to 11, we take 10 minutes, we'll just shave off 5 minutes the other side. Everyone, please grab a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. But thank you to everyone who's spoken so far. Brilliant talks, and thank you for the questions as well. See you in 10 minutes.
Thanks, Sam. Welcome back, everybody. Just going to wait a little while. Just wait another kind of 30 seconds or so, just over the 5 past, just to make sure everyone's got their cup of coffee and cup of tea. Okay, so welcome back. I hope you've had a really interesting and engaging morning so far, and that you managed to grab a drink. We've got another 3 brilliant presentations coming up, and I'm going to hand you over to the first presenter shortly, and that's Dr. Anthony Charles, Director of Postgraduate Taught Criminology at Swansea Uni. And he will be speaking enabling public criminology through co-production, creating learning partnerships and positive outcomes with young people. So looking forward to this one. So Anthony, over to you.
Yeah. Let me just share my screen. You find out why I do co-production work and not IT work. Can you all see a full screen there? Is that working? Or is it the other screen?
Looks good.
All right, it's not the right one. There we go. Okay, good morning, everyone. Hopefully, as Marcus said, this will be informative. I do hope so. I'm Anthony Charles. I'm an associate professor within the criminology department at Swansea University. As Marcus said, I'm also the program director for PGT Criminology. And just to give you a little bit of a background about where I come from in terms of my research and my position about public education and criminology. I'm one of those people who's very fortunate to be able to work in an area that's really progressive, really forward-looking. And so part of my role is to be a co-director of the Wales Observatory on the Human Rights of Children. And in addition to that, the academic area in which I operate is youth justice. And so a lot of what I do is at the forefront of human rights for children, the new sociology of childhood, and the ongoing debate across the United Kingdom around the UNCRC and implementation of that. And the way that I certainly approach public education and criminology with children is that there's a few things we need to do. First of all, demystify criminology, because it's something that affects everyday life. It's something that children have a view on, and as I'll come on to a little later, it's something that intimately affects, actually some of the critical discourse within criminology, it intimately affects many children in our schools. There's also the adultification of criminological discourse. This actually touches on what was alluded to earlier, which was about power and identity. Sometimes criminology can be seen as the preserve of a sort of middle-class elite, and certainly not for children. I take a very, very different view regarding that. And then finally, children can be partners for change when we look at criminology itself. And so helping their education in that discipline, to me, is something that we should be doing. In terms of the sorts of work that I do, I mean, I've spent a long time forging partnerships with local schools and local agencies, and I've put up on the screen there some of the sort of areas that I have focused on. Particularly the devolved agenda, which is really exciting at the moment, with the Welsh Parliament and the Welsh Government taking forward groundbreaking legislation and initiatives. Things such as rights respect in schools and how that may change the way that behaviour works in schools, the way that children see themselves, and also really critical community discussions that are happening. So, in the third point on the screen there, I mentioned community cohesion. When the Brexit debate, for example, was going on, I did work in local communities around how that affected community cohesion. And part of that was chronologically based, as it is. It's really, really important that we look at these things in a broader and holistic way. For me, and the type of work that I do, there are some key aspects of doing public education. I come from a position where research generally with me is co-produced. And it's about this dialogical approach where we talk to each other. I don't come from a position where I think that criminological knowledge is privileged. I don't come from a position where I think it necessarily needs to be based at universities, although we are rather good at criminology. There are things that happen in communities that we need to understand, we need to engage with, and we need to optimize and blend as well. And so for me, we have a methodology of priorities. What do people need to talk about in terms of criminology? How do we understand what they need to talk about? How do we address those things? There's also reality that we're not starting from ground zero, and there's experience in the community of interagency engagement between criminal justice agencies and with non-criminal justice agencies and the everyday lives of those people who are often our participants in research. Further, we have to recognise that many people have expert knowledge, which is not necessarily academic, but can really, really enrich and enhance our understanding of criminology. There's also, for me as well, I've always been a public sector worker, a real belief in the power of public agencies to make a change, and also doing two things there, to help professionals understand where they can take risks in introducing more radical criminological narratives into their work and encourage them to invest time into this process. I put that graphic up on the screen. It's really simple, but to me, it's part of this process. I've never really seen public education in criminology as being a one-off event. I don't think it is. I think it's about just trying to understand what already exists, to blend additional knowledge or insights that we may have, generate new knowledge, and then start again, keep building that process up. In terms of engagement, well, what have I done? I've forged partnerships, as I say, with schools mainly, and the local authority and our own department. And it's been predicated on trying to challenge orthodoxy and to look at applied criminology. It hasn't taken place in the form of lessons. It's about co-production, it's about co-learning. So it's been about identifying issues that need to be dealt with. I'll come on to one in a second. And then sharing knowledge, skills building, exposing individuals to different perspectives, asking people to be really challenging and critical in the way they see the world around them. And also to make the links between, and this is particularly important in youth justice, criminal justice focused issues and non-criminal justice focused issues, which are nonetheless criminologically significant. And for me, it's all about making that criminology agenda real and understanding that leadership of that and engagement in that can come from different parts of our community. I wanted to give you today an example. I know we're all limited by time, so I'm going to try and just move on quickly and give you this. One example of how I've certainly worked with schools to change things using a public education approach has been around behaviour. One school in particular I've worked with for, it's come on to 10 years now. We've built up a really good relationship of sharing criminological knowledge, engaging children and staff in different projects, encouraging this dialogue and conversation between individuals. And I was asked to engage in a process to ask the children about their behaviour. There were concerns in the school around the impact of negative behaviours on academic indicators, so core subject indicators and other indicators, disruption to lessons, harms, so a very sort of semiological approach to the harms associated with exclusion, but also then looking positively as to how can change be effected, how can it be forged. And what happened in that particular school was we set up a co-production process to try and ask the children, first of all, what actually is going on in school? Why is behaviour not as good as it could be? What effect does it have on individuals? How do you make something better that works? And that was also wound around not simply an academic understanding of a traditional school life. It was about a much broader lens. What is happening? And I should say in the community, onto this here, the school that community is placed within was a school with high multiple deprivation, issues around poverty, issues around criminality, actually a really good community, but with significant challenges. But what was really interesting was making an effort to learn really about the partner agency, the school, to see what they were doing that was positive. And this was part of my beginning point for this behaviour engagement. So the school we were working in was a rights respecting school, which was really culturally aware, had a massive emphasis on prevention and intervention, and also helping families and engaging in quite progressive approaches to things such as restorative practice, having the school as a community hub rather than just an educational institution. At the bottom of the screen there, you'll see the really big overarching strategic priorities of the school: to restore people, to give them confidence, to heal any problems, to promote positive behaviour, to engage in participative activity, particularly sort of Article 12, pro-Article 12 engagement, so it was meaningful, and also to innovate. Through the head teacher, the governing body and senior staff in the school, there was a willingness to say, hang on, perhaps we're not doing the best here, what do the children think? And so what did we do? In this particular instance, we created a child appropriate process to engage. I keep saying we because it wasn't just me, it's the other partners, it was the school, it was the children. A process of engagement with the school, bringing them to the university as well. So they had space away from schools, they could think, be honest, time to reflect. And we did this very sort of experiential learning approach to mapping out what was going on, what was really happening in their communities, why were people perhaps behaving in certain ways, you know, doing semiology, if you like, semiological analysis, but not calling it that, and applying new shared knowledge to create new approaches. So that was intimately focused on trying to empower participants, saying to them, you have this knowledge, you've got this knowledge, you've got this understanding, you've got this experience, and then disseminating to others, so empowering individuals. So what we did together was to create a new model. I've put on the screen there, you can see a dragon. I'm not being stereotypical for Wales. I was a proud Welshman. I'm very happy to see dragons. And what the children proposed was a tiered system that incorporated restorative practices that sought to minimise shame and harm to children through exclusion or suspension, and to optimise the services that were in the school. So family support services, giving people time out, having teachers perform not just a teaching function, but broader forms as well. I'll come on to the impacts of what happened when this process was operationalised in a second, but what I can say is it formed part of a rich fabric of engagement between certainly what I do and what the school does. I was thinking as I wrote this slide, I think it's important to put the second from last point in there, that this sort of public education approach, it's not a one-off event, it's a process. It's a process where power relationships change, where differences in our knowledge and our conversations change over time. It's all really, really important. What happened when we did implement a process that was, say, focused on things like restorative justice, social harm, on understanding the lives of individuals? Well, there were some very, very significant institutional changes. First of all, the teaching team and the school management really loved the process, took it forward, and what happened was quite groundbreaking. 68% decreased exclusions in 1 year. Foundation phase results doubled, and there's an increase in core subject indicator results. At the same time, there was a massive improvement in pupil behaviour and well-being. Teaching practice was enhanced through specific training and through learning about the new model and techniques, partly from the children, partly from peers, and then optimised family support and well-being. So if we're looking at this from a youth justice perspective, this was early intervention and prevention that was being brought in through a type of behaviour code that the children had discerned. It was mapped against some really positive metrics, if you like, so that were helping educational engagement, but also individuals and their well-being. For the young people, the engagement in that process, I think, was really quite powerful. First of all, they got to learn that we respect their knowledge. And again, and I hope I'm not coming across in any way sort of negative, these are young people who sometimes weren't respected. However, we respected their knowledge. It was really, really incredible, created a big difference. There was acquisition of new knowledge, both for the young people and for us. And they got to be partners for change in something that was really groundbreaking. Furthermore, simply being respected and taken to the university, being treated like the experts that they were, was critical. And also as well, them being told that they were seeing behaviour in ways that wasn't simply, somebody's naughty. They had a far more sophisticated, complex and analytical process going on, which related really well to many of the prevailing criminological narratives around risk, around support, around appropriate interventions. And in terms of the overall process, what's it done? Well, it's strengthened university, school and pupil relationships. It's made really clear, and this is just one of many sort of initiatives that we do around this, that there's a two-way learning experience. I've certainly learned a great deal. I always remember one quote from one of the young people. He said, you might work at the university, but you don't know as much as we do about schools. And he's absolutely right. That's why these sorts of things are really important. I can share my knowledge, others can share their knowledge. Ultimately, we have to engage with individuals. We have to impart, get involved ourselves in the public education debate and practice. There's also an issue around reflecting on, at the university, what this means for us. I teach youth justice modules at undergraduate and PGT levels, and this type of research now features quite prominently in those modules. So students as well can see how there's an alternative way to seeing public education. And finally as well, through this process, there's opportunities for others to get involved in doing this criminological engagement activity. So for instance, I've involved student interns at undergraduate and postgraduate level, and student researchers, and also PhD students have been inspired from this type of work. Also in the last year, don't worry, this looks like it's something from Doctor Who and Gallifrey. This is just a graphic I created for work I'm doing this year around COVID. And it seems to me that there's some inner circles there. These are types of support that children have, part of them being behaviour. In the last year, perhaps this public education research and engagement has now become more important than ever, because as you can see in that chart, there's sort of the thinner lines. That's what's happened as children were not able to get to school, not able to get to services, not able to get the support that they need. And so some of the real big successes I mentioned earlier that may have faded, we have yet to see. But it's a really exciting time and a need for that narrative to really be ramped up at the moment. And I think that's something the university can really, really engage with. And so to reflections from me, I'm a huge believer in public criminological approaches. I think they help people to think around what can change for the better. How do we promote positive behaviours? How do we promote positive approaches? How do we make the debate more progressive and more open? There's a transformative aspect to this as well. Certainly in schools where I've worked, as you can see earlier in the sort of the harder outcomes there, there's a real big impact. And that comes through talking around matters that are essentially criminological and empowering people to use those, giving them instruments to create change. There's an opportunity for us to resituate public criminological narratives. You know, social harm being a classic one I mentioned there, and actually seeing beyond traditional structures which are sometimes threatening, which are sometimes frightening, and which individuals, particularly vulnerable individuals, do not want to engage with, but they can in different ways. There's an exciting possibility around co-production, bringing academics and those that we often talk about together, which can be empowering for those who participate. And then finally, for me, it's about making criminology real. As my colleagues will tell you, certainly my PhD students will tell you, I'm a huge believer that if we have research that sits on shelves, we're not doing it justice. Rather, what we need to be doing is inspiring change, creating further research, and also encouraging others to use the really positive messages and positive techniques that are contained within the discipline of criminology. Thank you all very much. I hope I'm on time. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. I really enjoyed that. I really like the themes there, the strong co-production and inclusive engagement and valuing young people and their opinions and working as partners. So thank you very much for that, Anthony. That was great. And you were pretty much on time as well, so well done. Moving on then. So next we have Associate Professor Debbie Jones and Professor Tracy Sagar up, and they're going to be talking about making change through research and impact. And so I'm going to hand you over to them both now.
Thank you, Mark. Just to say, in the interest of time, I'll do the presentation, but Tracy will be available for the panel session at the end there. And I'm sure she might even chip in, because we've worked together so long now, we chip in all the time and each other can't help it. So I guess in this presentation, we wanted to talk about public education and public criminology in a bit more of a broader field, really, than just purely the traditional forms of education that we've talked about up until Anthony's presentation then. So what I want to start with is just to kind of consider a little bit about what this term impact means in terms of our academic practice, and just to kind of familiarise those terms for people that aren't familiar with the research exercise framework, actually. So for those that don't know what it is, and I'm aware that there may be some practitioners in the session today. yes, the ref impact is defined as this effect on and changing for the better. So looking at how academic research can make change for the better. And I think it really is become much more of a prominent feature in the research exercise framework, which is this, the way that research quality and excellence is measured across the UK. And you can see there, you know, it does have a big impact in the overall contribution to the ref submission from each university. I mean, there is money and finance attached to this agenda. So it was first introduced in 2014, but has actually taken on much more of a significant part of the ref submission, as I say. And I took this from a blog that was on the ref website, where it calls for researchers to be bold, to produce, you know, exciting, novel, adventurous impact that can be founded in pioneering research. And I suppose that's what myself and Tracy want to talk about today. Because the work that we have done has been around opening up academic research to supporting and helping those that are quite often the most highly stigmatised and marginalised groups within society, being sex work in this example. I just wanted to show some of the studies that we've taken part in since 2010. And I guess what I'd like to say about this slide is that we have tried to adopt this model of public education and public criminology in all of our work. And we'd be happy to discuss how we've done it in any of the other studies that you see there. However, the study that we're going to focus on today is the Student Sex Work Project. And the reason that we've picked that project is because, you know, that slide I showed you on the ref asking for people to be bold in their research. Well, certainly the Student Sex Work Project was bold, it was innovative, and it was risky. So we've picked that one as it is perhaps the most controversial project that we've been involved in to talk about. Where do we begin about making an impact? And I suppose we've taken this approach to all of our research, as I've said, very much like we've heard already from people talking about, you know, using pedagogies that are inclusive, and the project that Mark and I did looking at the role of higher education and desistance from offending. You have to start somewhere. And actually the place that we've started from is by adopting a participatory action research approach to our studies, to the way we carry out our research. And in the context of sex work, this has certainly been this growing body of research that has focused on an ethical methodological framework to carry out research on sex workers. Some of the key advocates of that have been Tina Sanders, Jane Pitcher, Rosie Campbell, Phil Hubbard, Jane Schooler, Nick May and Laura Gustin. You know, these people were kind of trailblazers, and perhaps increasingly Tracy and I have become fortunate to be considered as part of this group of academics who we all have a lot of respect for. But I just want to touch on this definition of participatory action research by Maggie O'Neill, who perhaps was the first person researching sex work to highlight the advantages of taking this approach. And in the context of what we're talking about today, adopting this participatory action research methodology, you know, it allows for this combination of experience and commitment that allows us to see and shape. And I think those are the really important words here: see and shape the relationship between knowledge and social change for making that impact. And of course, we've heard a lot about how the role of public criminology should be about opening up academia to beyond the walls of the journal articles, etc., etc. But a quote from Huang is also very interesting in the context of what we're talking about today, because what we see is action research as the creation of knowledge that requires this collaboration with practitioners. So if we're wanting to make a change, if we're wanting to make an impact, we have to engage. We can no longer be those sole academics that research from our ivory towers. It's about getting in, getting your hands dirty and working with people who are then able to enable this change that we want to make. And I think this quote from Huang also suggests that action research isn't focused primarily on the need for social science understanding of social phenomena, so, you know, which we traditionally think of as the role for higher education researchers, but should be ultimately concerned with affecting desired change and empowerment. So I think this is really a very useful methodological approach to take to all of your all of social research. I can't see a reason why you wouldn't. So The Student Sex Work project then, you can find out more about the project, you can read about the findings if you go to the project website. But I just want to kind of say, as you can see from the slide there, this was an interdisciplinary and interagency project from the start. And I think what we say whenever we talk about this project is it was funded by the Big Lottery Innovation Fund. And actually, when we started to put that project together, it was apparent that impact was going to be built in from the beginning. We wouldn't have been given the funding if the lottery hadn't seen the potential to make that social change and that impact immediately. It was the first cross-sector e-health service, and I'm going to talk more about that a little later on, so I won't say much about that. But again, any questions you've got on how we did that, please put it in the chat. But it was, you know, we took participatory action research, I would say, to a new level in terms of researching the sex industry, because we combined our research with a model of service delivery. And there are, you know, there were very few examples at that time of universities that had taken that bold step to actually make the change by delivering the service. But of course, it was a research project as well, and we put together a combination of quantitative and qualitative data collection tools. We had the student sex survey, which had a huge response from students across the whole of the UK. And we collected qualitative data from students higher education students who were working within the sex industry through a variety of mechanisms, such as additional interviews, using a net chat facility, and we transformed some of that data into some creative dissemination tools, which I'm going to talk about a little bit further on as well. We also had a members forum, so very much students who became part of the project became members of the project. They helped us steer the direction of the project at every single stage. We paid student sex workers to take part in the research as peer researchers, not as necessarily participants, but people who had as big a buy-in to this project as the traditional academic researchers. We had NetReach services, and we enabled a facility online where student sex workers could support each other. And not only that, our student volunteers within the project, we took over 80 student volunteers from across the whole of Wales into this project to help us facilitate it as well. And we identified quite early on that some student sex workers may provide an additional level of support. So we employed a specialist sexologist to provide online counselling for those student sex workers who needed it. Like we put the kind of overall aims of the project there at the bottom there, and you can see how that really fits with a public criminology agenda, promote learning and understanding. That was really one of the key aims of this project. And I think you can see the immediate impact and social inclusion that the project had. This is a quote here from one of the student sex workers who became a member of the project. You know, really discussing there how this person felt incredibly isolated, and it was only because of the project that they were able to open up some of the difficulties, some of the challenges that they faced, you know, marrying their higher education with their work within the sex industry as well. And again, you know, we'll talk more about that if anybody's got any questions on that. So I guess I mentioned creative dissemination, and some of the things that we did around that, of course, we did journal articles, you know, as the expectation is there from us, but we took this creative dissemination strategy to a whole new level, really. We produced some training and some education for practitioners. We gave a number of webcam recorded cameras to some of our members and said, go away and record yourself for a couple of weeks, some of your thinking, how it feels to be a student sex worker, and they sent that back to us, and it was incredibly powerful footage. We then worked with one of our partners, Professor Chris Morris from Newport Film School, who was able to transfer that content by using actors for protecting the anonymity of the people that worked on the project with us into a video diary. And we've used that video diary in a number of training sessions, and it is an incredibly powerful tool to get that wider dissemination of criminological research out there. We presented at numerous festivals, Hay, Cheltenham, you know, we really opened up these avenues for public engagement. We also produced a film called Fog of Sex, and you can access that film still on YouTube on the community channel. But we went round and did a number of film screenings and Q&A follow-up sessions to really promote this notion of public engagement and to maximise the impact of the film around reducing the stigma and raising awareness of the marginalisation of student sex workers. What I would like to do is just share a little bit of a film, part of the film that didn't make the final cut for Fog of Sex, just to kind of give you an indication of the type of creative dissemination that we've tried to adopt on the project. And let me see if I can find it. And we'll only use a little bit of it. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of difficulty here. I thought I'd loaded it already, but clearly I haven't. Here we go. And we'll watch a few minutes of it, and then we'll have to stop because of time. But you can watch it yourselves. Let me know if you can hear it.
What have you learnt about men?
Can you hear it okay?
Men are fascinated by women's vaginas. Just fascinated by them.
Can you hear it at all, Mark?
Yeah, we can hear it now. Thanks, Deb.
No worries.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to share your story with us today. I've just got to run through a few things which are regarding data protection. The interview will be protected under the Data Protection Act. You can stop the interview at any point. If you feel uncomfortable, feel free to say and we'll stop. Crucially, everything you say will be treated anonymously. We will change your name, we'll change your course and your uni, and also any identifiable things that you say will be changed. So are you happy?
Yeah, absolutely.
How did you get into it in the first place?
I was at university, in the halls of residence at university, and I was strapped for cash. I was kind of backed into a corner, really. So I did an audition at a pretty rough and ready strip club in Bristol. It was fully nude, pretty full on. And the guy wasn't really that fussed, really. He didn't really like fat women. He had this thing about giving fat women space, but, and he didn't like tattoos either. But I did the audition and got the job.
And when you worked there, did you work under your own name or did you have a pseudonym?
No, I was Harvey, as in Harvey's Bristol Cream. So hot, young, redhead, 18, university student. That was kind of my marketing tool. And the red hair thing was definitely a bit of a lure. And to be honest with you, it pretty much took over. I mean, I got my PhD and everything, but for a while I was dancing full time.
Beth, give me a definition of what people are looking for in a lap dancer.
Well, you must be slim, you must be toned, you must be perfect. A lot of the managers call it a Playboy 10. So Playboy magazine perfect. So their rules and regulations, headdresses, stilettos and jewelry, and you have to start your shift with the long dress. So there's this a certain way of being elegant and classy that's brought upon by the management. But women aspire to this particular very rigid style of beauty, which is obviously that brought upon by magazines and popular culture and so on and so forth. So I think to blame it straight away on the patriarchy just isn't right.
I'm going to stop that there just because of time. But if you watch the rest of it, what you'll see is Beth talk about the explanations, and she gives a very academic explanation of why people participate in the sex industry. So very much different from the traditional narratives that we see. And we've used this video a lot in the training that we've delivered to kind of start that discussion and try to break down some of those stereotypes that exist around the sex industry. So there we go. So what has been the impact of the way that we've approached this research, and how does that fit into kind of public criminology and public education, I guess? I just want to focus on three impacts from this project. And the first one is, like I said, the establishment of this first e-health service for student sex workers. And, you know, if you think back to that first definition of what REF are looking for in change and in impact, you start to see that this, you know, this project did bring about that. We changed something. There were no services, and we also improved existing services. Our partners, Terence Higgins Trust, developed their service provision for student sex workers, for example. And we see Public Health Wales take on the research to inform their sexual health review of Wales for 2017-2018. So, excuse me, what we start to see here is that by creating these impacts that go beyond what we traditionally think about as journal articles for academics can really have this real world impact. Keep going. Here we go. And we also worked with the NUS Wales, who were also our partners on the project, to try to bring about a more inclusive environment for student sex workers within universities. And I have to say that, you know, being bold, the REF calling for projects to be in bold doesn't always fit with that idea of what universities see as bold. And sometimes we've got to pull universities along with us on this agenda. It hasn't been something that has been popular with them for us to research. But you can see there how the project did impact on policy from a NUS point of view. It helped them think about how they could include student sex workers more inclusively within their policies. And I have to say that Professor Taylor Sanders really picked up the mantle in terms of policy development for higher education institutions and the issue of student sex work. I think she might be in this session today, but she's really picked up that mantle in the last year. But has, you know, in fairness, had a lot of resistance and backlash on social media for trying to support student sex workers by getting universities to develop some inclusive policies to support them as well. So I think the final impact that I want to talk about here, and this really speaks to public criminology and public education, is the empowerment of the student sex workers who took place, you know, in this project by having their voices included in public dissemination, debate, film, and the training of professionals, which was really important to them. So, you know, this project did not start out as something that was meant to be an potential impact case study for the REF. This started out as something that had well-intentioned meanings at the beginning. We wanted to change things for student sex workers with this project and give them a voice where their voice is often very hidden. So as you can see, you know, the film has had huge viewings, and we were very lucky that the BBC turned parts of the film into short clips of film for their series, Student Sex Workers Turning Fetishes into Finance. And you can see the enormous reach that has had in terms of public engagement. And like I said, we've incorporated lots of our research findings into training packages, not just the Student Sex Work project. And I would say, you know, we've either face-to-face or through our online delivery of our training packages, we've delivered this training to over 600 practitioners. That goes all the way from the police, the NHS staff, doctors, nurses, university staff, and that really has helped to bring about a change in public understanding, I suppose, of the issues experienced by student sex workers. And this is kind of a quote from one of the people that took part in some of the creative methods of dissemination. So taking part in the film has been a really important and life-changing part of my life. Still think about it a lot. It empowered me to start making changes. I feel like my story wasn't dramatised. And of course, we would never say that this project speaks for all student sex workers. We would never say our work speaks for all sex workers. But sometimes, you know, we have to find a way to support those who don't have a vehicle to express themselves. I feel the film gave me a voice when I never had one before. That's been massively empowering to me. So I think what we can see in these three examples is not only impact on policy and practice, but also impact on people's lives as well. That's somewhat, Mark, and then I'm done. So summing up, public education can take many forms. I think it really can. The media strategy that we developed for the Student Sex Work project resulted in it being reported in 23 countries over 5 continents, which is an enormous reach. Taking a broad view of what public education means and how public criminology can contribute to that through films, through lots of different platforms for presentations, through art, through blogs, public-facing website. That website was accessible to everybody from day one, and very much research-led training, so evidence-led practice. And we always finish with something from a student sex worker, because that's what the whole project was about. And this was a still from a Researchers' Art competition we entered, and we won for Emotion in Art. And it just illustrates, it's still from the film, and it just illustrates the impact, that introspective look from the student sex worker on how she sees herself in this image. So that's it from me. There we go.
Deborah, thanks very much. Really, really powerful stuff. And just want to say a few notes myself. Brilliant, engaging approaches with significant impact that we can all see. And what clearly come out is giving voice to those that are often silenced and not heard. So thank you for sharing that with us today. Okay, so we're a little bit over time, but we've got a little bit of slippage in the next session, so that's okay. We've got senior lecturer in criminology now, Mark Jacobs, and he'll be talking about the myopia of public criminology and the need for critical educational impact. So over to Mark now, and thank you.
Right, hello everybody. I hope I'm now on your screen, having replaced the chair, and now I need to discover where my PowerPoint slides are. So share screen. Oh, which one is that? That's number 2. Share. Okay, I believe you can now see my screen, which I'll put into. Right. Okay, hopefully you can see the presentation there. Just so you're aware, if anyone's had trouble with their children getting off tablets, this has been a godsend. It's a little stopwatch, and I've set it now 15 minutes, so I'm going to use it today for myself, but it's been a godsend in terms of getting children to stop using the tablet. So I'm going to use that for myself, so hopefully that will keep me to the 15 minutes or thereabouts. So without further ado, I've called this paper The Myopia of Public Criminology and the Need for Critical Education and Impact. And essentially what I want to do is make 2 key arguments in this paper. One is that I think we have been guilty of missing an important component of the public by not recognising the importance of teaching. Now, given that most of us are probably involved in teaching very large numbers of undergraduates in criminology. So my argument is that to be more fully engaged with the academy doesn't involve what Loader and Sparks says in terms of engaging the policy elite, but engaging the students in which we encounter on a more or less daily basis, more often not recently through our online medium. But I think it's been very important that we don't overlook the significance of our role as educationalists in terms of engaging students. So here my notion is about myopia, because not only has Ian Loader and Richard Sparks neglected the significance of the large body of students who make up a large fragment of the public, but they're also myopic in terms of understanding these students very often go on to work for the criminal justice agencies, of which we are seeking to change, improve, maybe even transform. Not only if they don't go into working as practitioners, they have become citizens of the greater polity who should be inculcated with a sense of civic responsibility and political awareness. So I think it's important that we need to acknowledge that the first step towards a practice of a more public criminology is to engage with our most immediate audience, namely the students. Now this leads to a second question really about what is taught. And today we've discussed quite extensively about the values of education and the kind of education that students achieve. So in this I want to ask really, well, what is criminology? And within today's paper, I really wanted to create that dichotomy and binary between applied criminology and theoretical criminology, and ask, what we have as academics included in our curriculum. And really what I want to begin to pose is, as Becker did in 1967, to ask, whose side are we on? Are we on the side of the crime control industry, or what some people refer to as the prison industrial complex, or are we on the side of the subaltern, the marginalised, the repressed, and so on and so forth? So secondly, my question is to challenge the book published by Loader and Sparks, and really align myself with some reviewers such as Elliot Curry, Niels Christie, Joe Sim, and Rhys Walters, who argued for a public criminology should be engaging with not the policy elites, but with activist groups, campaign groups, grassroots, community groups, and so on and so forth. And what I'm really arguing for is, rather than be this cool, measured, empirically informed knowledge and education, which very much Sparks and Loader argue for, I'm actually arguing to revive the 1970s radical criminology and to revive the political intellectual engagement, so that we dislodge the acquiescence and contentment and the compliance of which we can sometimes be guilty of as educationists, in terms of churning students out to become police, prison, probation officers, and the other assortment of crime controlling agents. And I really want to revive an argument which actually many people have a sympathy with, in terms of what's been coined today as the criminological imagination. But I'm also mindful, of course, that, as Mark Jones said in his paper, we need to understand the current context of higher education, which is subject to commercialisation, commodification, and so on and so forth. But I want to finally conclude today by arguing that public criminology should be underpinned by what I refer to as a partisan pedagogy. So it's an education which is political. So this is something I know, having had many conversations with my friends in the Learning and Teaching Network, about the great emphasis that is placed within HE on publication. But what I want to really set that against is, we probably have a greater impact on the hordes of students who attend our real or online teaching events. So within the academy, greater prestige is given on research and publications, but I think we could have a greater force and impact, Mark Jones mentioned this word, force for change, upon the students who attend our lectures. I just want to draw upon one quote from Rhys Waters, which was in this review symposium to the Public Criminology by Sparks and Loader. And he, like myself and like some other commentators, says, where are the students? How can an analysis of the success and failure paradox of criminology be complete without criminology's role in education and the ways students' attitudes, experiences, and careers become part of that publicness? So I, like others, I'm arguing, we need to engage the students. I'm arguing really then, we therefore have before us, and up until my paper today, an unacknowledged army of agents for social change. And just as an indication of the kind of numbers we might be talking about, I just did a quick unempirical analysis of the UCAS courses. And here I just use the filters. You might be able to just make it out. The filters I've looked for a full-time undergraduate criminology course commencing next September. And as you can see, there's 902 full-time undergraduate criminology courses now offered by 149 HEIs, higher education institutes. So it's a huge numbers of students who are engaged in a criminological education of some sort. Within this, we've also got combined honours and other related type of courses. So there's a large number of students. Added to that, of course, we've got 150 master's degrees in criminology offered by universities up and down the country. So hopefully you're getting a sense of, actually, this is a large body of individuals who could be this force for change. Now, as an example, and I'm not sure if I'm giving away any kind of confidential information here, but at the University of Portsmouth, where I work, we've currently got approximately 1,300 students studying full-time undergraduate degree in the Institute of Criminal Justice Studies. So that's 1,300 students. Every year, therefore, we've got that, 500 students graduating who could go out and become the force for change. We also, with my institute, have 115 postgraduate students who are taught on campus. Added to that, we've got 450 students who are studying by distance learning, either at undergraduate or postgraduate. So huge numbers of students who are coming in front of us as educationists. Added to this, we also provide, as do some of my colleagues up and down the country, professional contracted out courses for probation and police officers. Now, there's around about 40 people attending today. We could do the mathematics. Of all the institutes that you work at, we can, come up with a large number of students. So I'm arguing that we need to engage these students in the debates. Now, it's interesting that Debbie was talking earlier about this idea of action research, and very much aligned with the idea of praxis, this movement for change, for transformation. And I'm reworking and reminding us of the activism that was present in the 1970s, and is certainly which commenced with the convening of the National Deviancy Conference in 1968, which then became the new criminology. And I'm just quoting here one of the Young Turks of the Fortunate Generation, Jock Young. And he says there was a massive expansion in social science education in this period, 1960s, 1970s. Courses in criminology and the sociology of deviance sprung up in every major institution of higher education, and were taught very largely by individuals who were in and around the new radical organisation, the National Deviancy Conference. So what I'm trying to argue here is that this form of public criminology existed in the 1970s. Academics were not just academics, they were activists. We had people like Stan Cohen, who is involved with the RAP, the Prison Radical Alternatives to Prison. He published, along with this is here with I think it was Laurie Taylor, Prison Secrets. What I'm arguing here is that there was a great engagement with the wider public. There was a great engagement with the grassroots campaigning for change. And of course, this also incorporated radical students who were drawn to studying the sociology of deviance. I've also got images here of the work from the Birmingham School and the Institute for Race Relations in terms of trying to create social change around issues of racism. Pat Carlin was also very much involved with setting up women in prison and the publication here, Alternatives to Holloway. So what I'm arguing here is that many of these activists were involved in a form of action research, and indeed many of the people part of the countercultures became involved as students. So these people did have impact. Cohen's work and other had an impact upon debates around decarceration. Feminists had huge impact upon trying to improve the conditions and life experiences of women, huge differences in terms of impact upon race relations, and so on and so forth. I'm just quoting here Chancellor McLaughlin, and they argue, criminologists have had to confront the embarrassing fact that society is saturated with crime talk. They have utmost difficulty in communicating with politicians, policymakers, professionals, and the public. And again, even Chancellor McLaughlin have overlooked, ignored that huge constitution of students amongst us. But for my purposes today, I want to begin to ask us as educationalists, what difficulties exist for us to communicate with students, to create this active body of agents of social change, to create this body of people who could seek this social transformative agenda. Now, I really want to wrap up three key reasons, although there are many more. Despite the potential for mobilising this army of public criminologists, there's profound obstacles in achieving this, and indeed huge obstacles in achieving this within the university sector, which is increasingly beset by values of competition, consumerism, and commodification of learning. So I want to just try and touch upon these debates about not taking sides. There's too much of a detached, impartial, neutral form of education. The increasing marginalisation and denuding of sociology and theoretical concerns, and teaching becoming very much, I think, an earlier speaker mentioned about this textbook or book learning. But learning theory, like some of the things that have been touched upon today, should be a live and contested issue. So I'm really trying to challenge the Loader and Sparkler's argument that they're trying to sort of cool the climate down. Whereas I'm arguing what we need is a revival of the 1970s heated political moment of critical consciousness. And I'm really using these books and images here just as metaphors, I suppose, because do we as educationalists only concern ourselves with priming students to become part of what Niels Christie refers to as the crime control industry, to become the police officers, the crime scenes investigators, the probation or prison officers? And I'm also drawing upon the work of coming out from North America, the notion about the school to prison pipeline, Now, this notion about the school to prison pipeline is very much about the racialized way in which young Afro-Caribbean, African-American people go from school into prisons. But another aspect of this, some commentators wrote about, is the aspect of educating people to work in the criminal justice system. That's what we are concerned with. Very much we speak about, what employment opportunities there will be for students to go and work as police, probation, and so on and so forth. And on the flip side of that is heating up the education, where students should be inculcated with a broader, critical imagination. Rather than education being problem solving, it should be problem posing education. Students should begin to think about deep-seated issues of, the isms, whether that's sexism, classism, ableism, sexism, speciesism. So I'm rattling through this quite quickly. This is a quote from Dick Hobbs, who was quoted by Paul Rock in his paper published in 2005. And I think what I'm arguing here, 2 minutes, I've rattled through it even quicker, and I see I've got a minute on my own timer. What I'm arguing for is that criminology theory is becoming increasingly detached from the learning experience of our undergraduates. And what Hobbes is arguing for is the discrete, the more that criminology becomes a specialized subject, the more it becomes detached from theoretical ideas. What were once thought of as the foundations are increasingly ignored. And this is touched upon in the availability of, textbooks, which very much offer, bite-sized chunks of information, but don't give that epistemological underpinning. But there are a number of commentators now today who are reviving the need, the necessity, the importance for theory and sociological, critical social theories within the learning experience. Oh my goodness, I'd have to get off my tablet now. I'll wrap this up very quickly. What I'm trying to argue is this idea of the partisan. Many students rely upon the textbooks such as by our friend Tim Newburn, but the book itself is banal, it's boring, it's dull, it does very little to engage students as, theory being something which is active, which is polemical. What New Criminology did in 1973 was to take a particular standpoint. We knew whose side they were on. I also want to remind ourselves that we are at this moment of social change, very much being spearheaded by the young. This term I encountered last week, this idea of the woke generation, where they are becoming very much more informed with issues of social justice, with oppression. The images here you can see on your screen are things we're probably very familiar with. But young people are also, defunding the police, are beginning to think about a transformative agenda where we don't have the formal mechanisms of control, whether it's the police and so on and so forth. So lastly, because I have exceeded, and if I was my child, I'd be grabbing onto my tablet saying, no, no, no. I just want to end with a quote from Elliot Curry. And I'm really arguing again that what we need to develop is this idea of partisan pedagogy. We can't just stand on the middle and say we need to be involved in evaluative projects. We need to reform the system. What I'm beginning to argue for is maybe we need to think that the system itself is the problem. So to conclude with Elliot Curry's quote here, we need to develop ways of fostering a criminology that is more than a relatively passive witness to the destruction wrought by contemporary global forces, much less, which I think many of us may be guilty with, be an accomplice to it, and instead vigorously steps up to take the job of combating these forces and dedicating itself unapologetically to the reduction of needless pain, fear, and injustice around the world. Apologies for overrunning a little bit, but I hope you get a sense of what I'm trying to convey here. Thank you.
Mark, thank you for that. I really, really enjoyed that. I really like that idea of perhaps a reattachment of a more critical and radical criminology. And I love the idea of an army of public criminologists marching through Britain and being an active force for change. So thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. We have a number of questions. We've obviously run over a little bit, but we do have some space between 12 and 12:30. Tracy will be closing, but if everyone's okay, could I ask a couple of questions that have been posed and then we could move on to the closing? Yeah, great stuff. Okay, so a general question from Helen Jones from the British Society of Criminology. I've slightly reworded it, but what advice this is to everybody. What advice for others would you have for those working in higher education to gain or have the full support of your university in engaging within public criminology kind of projects?
Kirsty, do you want to take that one?
Sorry, that's about identities. Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was busy doing my closing. No,
it's all right. It's a more general question for everybody.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to others working in HE that have or want to work in more sort of public spheres? How do you gain and maintain the support from the university that you're embedded within?
There's been a paper that Debbie and I have been about to write for about 4 years now, and one day we'll get the time. But it's been called several different titles, from Walking the Walk to, at one point, we were thinking about Nike, just do it, you know, just get out there and do it. And I think if I have any advice to pass on, it's almost like we really push forward. And we sort of really bravely put things that were impact creating into our bid right from the beginning. And the university, we dragged kicking and screaming with us. And perhaps that's not really fair, because, I mean, we did get university support. We definitely did, and from our immediate managers. But we really asked an awful lot of the university, you know. So I think that it's tricky, and it depends on what institution you're in. But my gut feeling is you just try. You've just got to try.
That's great, thank you. And I'm going to ask Anthony the same question, just simply because you obviously work with children and young people, so there's particular issues there as well. Could you kind of give your take on that, please, Ant? Yeah, of course. In some ways, similar to what Tracy said. I mean, for me, I've been very, very fortunate. We've got a very supportive school. And in terms of things like children's rights, it's a major priority for the university, not just in a sort of abstract theoretical context, but also empirically. I mean, I've been fortunate in some ways, and I came from local government, so I had a lot of the links already in the local community. But you know, part of it for me was, and this is, I suppose, the advice bit, is sitting down and being clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and then explaining to senior managers and allowing them to see the vision there. And I've got to say exactly the same as Tracy. I mean, the university's been incredibly supportive in Swansea. I can't say anything more than that. And similarly, the local authority as a major gatekeeper, they've been very supportive as well. So I suppose it's been about investing that time to make sure you're clear what you're doing and explaining what you're doing. Absolutely, thank you. And I guess Swansea University, as you've both said, has been massively supportive, but perhaps there are other universities that aren't quite as supportive. And so I should imagine that brings certain challenges. There was a really nice question as well. I'm going to move on now, and although I think initially it was asked towards Debbie, I might flip it. It's from Helen, and I might ask Mark if you're okay with this. One of the questions was, do you think that the QA benchmarks are in need of updating a little bit in terms of criminology? And should public criminology have a greater focus in the curriculum as a real push for more positive change and innovation? I think that aligns quite well to some of the messages that you were in your presentation. Just wondering what your thoughts were, Mark, on that.
I do think the QA benchmarks need to be revisited. I think they tend to be very vacuous, and they have been interpreted by some universities in particular ways which I would be concerned with. I do think there has to be a reinvention and reassertion of the importance of social justice. We talk too much about criminal justice. We're at a point in our time where there's huge disinvestment in the public services, of which it leads to, you know, crime control agencies and a more, you know, I often say to students, you know, when I started studying, there were degrees in social policies. Now those degrees in social policies have disappeared, and they've been replaced by degrees in criminal justice degrees. So I do believe we need to reinvent a greater civic mission, a more politically aware and less neutral, impartial, empirical criminology. Okay. Yes, I do think there needs to be revisited. The significance of challenging and resisting and rethinking. Okay, that's great. And just Anthony and or Deb or Tracy, would you like to add anything else to that sort of discussion? Or
no, I would agree with Mark. I think there is an opportunity that the benchmarks are coming up for review at the moment, and I think there is an opportunity to look at them again and to see how we can, I don't think it's about going backwards, but I do think some of those points that Mark made about, it's almost like a moment in time at the moment with everything we've seen around social justice, to go back and pick up that mantle from the 1970s. And I think there is a call for more engagement around public criminology, and getting students involved in everything we do, Mark. We've tried every way we can at Swansea to get our students involved in that, as well as giving them the skills to become police officers, probation officers, and all of those things in some ethical framework. So I think there is a good opportunity to do something with that, Helen, yeah.
Just to add on that as well, I think it's an important point. We're talking about criminology, not criminal justice. And those terms seem to become interchangeable these days, and perhaps they shouldn't be. I think that's one of the key points we've got to try and deal with. It's about criminology. These are about sociological issues. These are about anthropological issues. These are about really intrinsically massive issue. It's not simply about, just pick up a Mark's point, it's not just about the criminal justice system. It's a small part of it. And I think if the QAA could perhaps emphasize that a little more in a more sort of pragmatic manner, that might be helpful to many of us who have to apply those QAA benchmarks.
Thank you. Have I got? Sorry, Mark.
Sorry, because I think universities up and down the country talk a lot about employability and make work-ready graduates, and we've conceptualised work-ready in terms of going to work for the criminal justice professions. But I don't think we promote enough working for community groups, working for non-profit organisations, working for activist groups, and so on and so forth. We are guilty of and of course this is being threatened by linking university courses with the salaries of graduates, and of course it's linked problems with the Delhi statistics. We shouldn't be turning students out just to work as employees. We should be turning students out who are politically, civically, globally engaged.
Yeah, we've just introduced a third-year module that does that exact thing, Mark, entrepreneurial criminology.
Let me just study.
And I think, if it's okay, one kind of final, and I'll ask for a quick answer from everybody, but I'm going to pull all that together. One of the questions, and I really like that. Thank you for this question, Jordan. Do you feel there's a place or a need for a wider curriculum at school on sociology, criminology, and political science in supporting children and young people to gain a greater understanding, and I might add greater self-agency around them today? Do you think there is a real need for that? And I'm going to press you to make your answers short and sweet. And I'm going to go to Anne first.
There you go, yes. There's a quick
answer. You can go yes. Go on, Debs, you are yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's something to say.
I'd say yes, but I'd also say one other thing is that we absolutely underestimate how much about those topics children already know as well because of their lived experience. And that's another reason why we should be doing that.
Great, good. Yeah, thank you, Anthony. Good point. And Mark, finally?
I would worry, because hopefully parents up and down the country have discovered the banality of the education their students are getting at the moment, because it closes down critical thought, it closes down creativity, it closes down imaginative thinking. So it's not just about social justice, it's about how we all encounter students who struggle with thinking and using concepts because they want answers. No, we don't deal with answers, we deal with thinking conceptually and abstractly. And students struggle with that immensely.
So a more critical kind of education from earlier on anyway, a critical consciousness rather than a parrot kind of learning fashion, which could be ascribed to the current education system in the lower levels. Okay, well, look, thank you, everybody, for your presentation.
Sorry, Mark, I think Anne wanted to say something there as the educationalist in the group, because she's probably got more insight than any of us.
Not only to echo what other colleagues have said, actually, but our children are victims of the education system that we've purported is the right model. We have created young people who are driven to answer questions in exam conditions, and to think that there is a truth and that there is a right answer, and there is no wonder that they come to university ill-prepared to do anything other than to ask the question and to answer the question that is posed in what is considered to be the right tone. And I think critical agitation, questioning one's position, questioning oneself in one's society and the rationale for that can only lead to a more democratic society in which we can all be equals and have multiple identities and don't have to be driven by the identity that is historic. So, you know, because you were a prisoner 5 years ago doesn't mean that you have to be a prisoner for the remainder of your life, but our education system deems that to be the case, and I think that's a shame.
Thank you. We have a number of other questions. We'll get back to those who have asked questions that we haven't answered in due course through emails and types and stuff, but I think it's about 12:15. I'm going to hand over to Professor Tracy Sakar.
Well, I have to say I've now got about 20 pages of notes because it was all so interesting. I've gone completely overboard, hence why I'm frantically trying to skip out some of the information. So you'll have to bear with me. I was a bit worried that I'd got half an hour to fill to wind this up, and now I'm a bit worried I'm not got enough time. So to keep me, so I don't go off on tangent, I am going to follow my notes a little bit closer than where I usually would. So I'll try and be quick. But it's always great at events like this, isn't it, when you've had really, really interesting papers to draw together some of the key themes. And we started the morning, didn't we, with Anne, Paul and Kirsty, who spoke about the Learning Together programme. And I thought it was absolutely the start of such a brilliant programme of work. In terms of prison education, you know, to hear about this and describe, you know, a failing education system for prisoners where prison education had stalled. And the Learning Together programme really is a step in the right direction of filling in that gap. I thought it was fantastic partnership work, you know, just to hear about the relationships, how they've expanded and built with HMP. And, you know, it's something to be extremely proud of. Importantly, we were told that the programme provides a safe space for all students. And again, this is a clear theme running throughout the day about, you know, empowering all students through public criminology. But creating that safe space to discuss some, you know, which can be quite testing issues like prison education, philosophies of punishment, desistance, interventions. And also emphasised about the programme's philosophy, which ultimately, I love this, ultimately aims to flatten power within the learning space. And I thought, I am so going to steal that. I am so going to use that at some point. I really love that phrase. So a brilliant paper. A second paper was from Joey. And again, although he said he wasn't a criminologist, I wouldn't believe him. He came across as good as any criminology expert I've ever had a conversation with. And his paper again was the Inside Out programme being delivered in Cardiff. And it was lovely to hear from Joey because the programme had been set up since 2018. He could actually sit back and pause and offer us some reflection, you know, what he'd actually got out of the programme, what the students had. And I thought it was really interesting as well to hear him talk about managing risk. You know, you raised a lot of issues that I'm sure this programme's had its challenges, but you seem to be, you know, absolutely flying. Interesting to hear how the students were really challenged again to think about issues, again, punishment, crime rehabilitation, crime and justice. And your paper, like Anne and Kirsty's and Paul's, I think really brought home this ethos and dedication and planning that's required to build this kind of great learning environment. So, you know, creating a level playing field is not easy. It's not even easy within an HE setting, you know, never mind when you take these programmes out into the community. So, you know, hats off. I think it's absolutely fantastic what work that you're doing. And what we could really see by looking at these programmes, that good teaching is about empowerment, isn't it? It's about empowering every student that's sat in that room. So that was absolutely fantastic. And then we went on to Debbie and Mark's paper again, which really was focusing again on how education can be a powerful motivator for change. I think we all wanted to know a lot more about the pictorial analysis, which just looks so brilliant. And I'd steal that again if I could, but I don't think I can. Absolutely brilliant. And it came as no surprise to hear that the research partner was Include, because Include is an organisation in Swansea that absolutely prides itself on inclusivity. And you can see that throughout the whole, again, ethos of the research design, the focus group, which did sound lively. I'd like to hear more about that. I need to read the article. But yeah, again, brought to light some really, really key issues. And I think, again, one thing I took away from that was still how important it is tackling stigma, and maybe perhaps universities, regardless of how really genuinely felt the civic missions are, maybe there is a little bit of time here, space to sit back now and reflect and see actually what are the obstacles, what's stopping certain things being achieved like this. So maybe it's time for a revisiting. But again, an amazing, fantastic set of papers, and really got me thinking anyway about how our ethics in research, our ethics, our ethos of inclusivity and empowerment, how it's really important in us teaching as well, and particularly in community-based programmes that we heard about today. So a second set of papers then, and really seamlessly well planned, guys, because it's seamless, wasn't it? How it went into the afternoon, but bringing again some of these key themes. And Anthony kicked off the second session, and it's great. He really got us excited about human rights and how co-produced research with children and young people, how young people can be partners for change. Absolutely amazing work that he's doing. And it's through co-production, isn't it? This ability to empower that can in turn also impact then on public sector agencies and make them a force for change as well. He talked about, again, I might nick this, the rich fabric of engagement. I really like that phrase. Another one I might steal, a process where power relationships change. And again, that doesn't come easy. That is a lot of planning, a lot of thought process, but where the lives of children could be understood, really important. And again, it travels throughout every single paper today. This is about real challenges, lived experiences. That's the only way we make good, positive social change. So all our papers today were presentations about passion, wasn't there? Passionate about education as a tool for positive social change. We went on to hear from Debbie. I say Debbie because I was quietly in the background taking notes. But again, focusing on public education as a vehicle to achieve impact. And I think that what was important about Debbie's paper is that it did show that research can achieve positive social change, but it can also be good for universities, and universities shouldn't be actually scared by this. So again, without jumping onto Mark's paper, but perhaps we should be a bit bolder, and there is a need for us to be more activist in what we're doing. And what the Student Sex Work Project did on many levels was ask the university to run with us and really step out of its comfort zone, to never provided services to sex workers. It had never provided sexual health services in this way. And it did it, and it did it with good grace most of the time. But this public education, we, right from the off, created many, many different tools, sort of, again, that real forward planning about how we could perhaps best make change. And those tools were then incorporated into lots of different training. And Debbie didn't mention, but I think it's probably about 1,000 people up and down Wales that we've trained. And, it's something to be very proud of. So when we got onto Mark then, I agreed with everything that you said, by the way, Mark, as well. And Loader and Sparks, I thought that you hit the nail on the head. And it's not about, is it public education? It's not about the policy elite. It's not about engaging with, those further up the chain. This is really at grassroots level. Everything that I know that Debbie and I have achieved that we're really proud of is because we've been activists and we've been engaging at grassroots level. And how brilliant with what you said, and surely that starts then with our students. And I have to say, again, Debbie and I took through 70 student volunteers on the Student Sex Work Project because we really wanted our students to be immersed in the research that we were doing. So I really did think that, everything that you were saying about activism, we shouldn't be shy of this. This is something that we've all got it in us, and it's not always easy, is it? Because as we know, institutions differ, red tape differs, but it's really thought-provoking what you say. And again, I think it's all about being bold. So thank you. I really, really enjoyed that paper. I think I just want to say, because I'm really conscious of time, that I'm into the last few minutes, because I want to pass back to Debbie to really just bring it to a close. I want to thank Debbie and all the team that's been working with her, Kate, everybody, because this has been Debbie's initiative, leading the way with Kate and others at the BSc. This will make a blush now, but this has been our first major learning and teaching event of its kind at Swansea University. And I know that it's been something that she's been passionate about getting off the ground for a long time. Even COVID couldn't keep Debbie down with this. Just had to go on a back burner until, you know, enough was enough, it had to happen. So huge thank you to her and to all as wonderful presenters and chairs. Mark, everybody at Swansea and everybody that's helped to make today really special, because the chairing was brilliant as well. So I'm just going to pass you back to as brilliant Debbie Jones and just say thank you.
Embarrassed now, embarrassed. Listen, thank you, Tracy. That was really insightful. I don't know how you managed to do that time and time again, of listening and writing at the same time. I've never mastered that skill ever. I don't know how you do it. Just before we do close, I want to say an enormous thank you to Lynn, who's sitting quietly somewhere in the background, who has pulled this event together for us. She is incredible, and just a massive thank you, and thank you for hanging on and not having that baby yet. Thank you, Lynn. But I am going to say the final words, I guess, are going to hand over to Kate just to kind of sum up very briefly.
Oh, hello. Yeah, absolutely. I just had, how much time have I got? We've got 2 minutes. Just some key takeaways really from everything that we've heard today. It's been great. And as Tracy said, I think what came through all of it was this passion, and this passion to be transformative, to be progressive, to ensure that we've got that partnership with everyone, and that's with the community, that's with students, that's with in terms of strategically. So when we're looking at those benchmarks and at the QAA, you know, I think we need to be thinking about how we can look to the future, and Mark's paper was great at that. So I think you really kind of picked up on some timely discussions and debates that are going on here in this, and you're absolutely right, in this moment of social change. And so I do feel that you emphasise that really well, as did all the papers who talked about promoting learning and teaching, alongside being force for change, being agents, you know, everything being co-produced, and the need, as Anthony said, to identify, blend and develop. There was loads, there was just so much to take, and Tracy summarised it excellently as well. So I just want to kind of finish by again saying thank you so much to everyone at Swansea, to Debbie Jones in particular, for all of your just enthusiasm, and as Tracy said, you know, we've been having frequent conversations since well, last year really. How can we do this? Can we move it online? What are we going to do? Is it possible? When's the best time to do it? And I'm just, yeah, I'm in awe at how you've done this, and it's brilliant. So thank you to everyone and all the administrative staff as well there. And I'll just take my final note, just say anyone interested, a bit of a plug, anyone interested in joining BSc Learning and Teaching Network, I will get Debbie to put up a link to our WordPress site, which has got all the information about some of the areas that we're interested in. It's got some information on members, on symposiums, on previous events. And, you know, we're always looking for blogs, and for information on other related events that may be happening with other societies as well. So please, you know, have a look there and get in touch with myself if you're interested, because I thought I'd take this opportunity to have a plug there, to see if any of the participants and anyone observing today would quite like to get involved with the Learning and Teaching Network. It's been great. So I just wanted to express my thanks to everybody, and some great questions as well. I've added some in there. I think it was Mark Jones that said that we will try and get back to those. And again, there's some really good questions. I'll try and put the link to this onto the WordPress site as well for the Learning and Teaching Network, and also get in touch with Helen Jones, so I know who's watching, to say maybe we can get it on the BSc information as well. It's been a great event, and well done everybody.
Thank you, Kate. And yes, it is recorded, so we will find places to put it. You're right. Well, sure, Lynn will find places to put it. The final thanks, of course, go to the audience. You know, to the people that came along and listened to our rambling thoughts about, you know, being an activist and doing a little bit more. You know, without you, there wouldn't be any point to this whole presentation. So thank you for coming, everybody. And let's see what comes out next. Let's see where we go from here. Bye, everyone.